Hello and welcome to another episode of the Reeve podcast. Today's guest is a podcaster, comedian, author, project manager, former TV producer. It's Matthew Bogg. He's returned to the show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
Very happy and a great mood. I'm very happy to have you back on the show. It's been
So why are
two
you in a great
years.
mood? Why are you? That's always something that interests me. Why are you in a great mood? I mean, I guess it's probably what, about 5 o'clock your time there, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock your time.
It's 4 o'clock. I'm happy because I'm doing this. I'll be honest. Like right now, where my life is at, I can't find a job. I'm creatively stifled as far as like acting is concerned because there's not been work in a long time. And I'm sure you're aware of the situation, what's going on in the
Sure.
States right now as we record this. This will be out in August, but we're recording this in July. And that inevitably has a knock-on effect on the British film industry as well. And I think the frustrations in me are growing because I'm every day doing everything I can to find work in anything. Like I've been applying for even just like cleaning jobs just to get some money coming through.
Well, I should have
And
known that. We just got a new cleaning service here.
yeah,
I mean, the trip would kind of be a bitch, but
yeah,
still,
I was gonna say I'd have to take out like a mortgage to get over there. Yeah, no, and that's frustrating. But I guess to bring it back to my point is there are certain things in my life, certain constants that I'm very grateful for, and this is one of them. This show, well, when I stopped focusing on the numbers so much, and I started focusing on just like putting together a good show each and every time, and really just diving headfirst into my guests and my topics and stuff, I got a lot more out of it. Like I enjoy the show more now than I ever have done before, and I look forward to it, man. I always do, because I know it's always going to be good. I'm always going to get something out of it. I'm always going to learn, grow, all of the above.
have you found that it's easier to do now?
Yeah, weirdly. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I'm a stickler for like plans and such. So I think that, well, if you do a podcast, and I wanted to get onto podcasts with you anyway,
Mhm.
but I'll just say this real quick. I've heard so many bad podcasts and bad shows, and one of the biggest reasons why they're bad is that they don't have a structure. It's like, as a listener, how are you supposed to follow that when it's just a bunch of incoherent thoughts, or I don't know, like tangents? And don't get me wrong, it's okay to go on certain tangents here and there, but you got to pull it back, you got to rein it back, you got to have like some degree of structure, or it's just chaos, but not enjoyable chaos. Because I think there's a lot of people out there that think like, oh, I'll put a podcast together because me and my buddies have hilarious conversations, and it's like, you may very well do, and they may be very good shows. No, but see, that's the thing, right? And we'll get into your show later, but like when I listen to your show, it's not an incoherent mess. There might be like mucking around and boys kind of chat, but at the same time, like there's structure there. There's something the listener can follow and listen to and continue to listen to. And that's why our respective shows have gone on as long as they have, because it's like there is that structure. And we will have that listener base of people who are looking forward to that because there's something to follow. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it's okay to break script once in a while, try different things, etc. But if you just, like I see, and this is the unfortunate aspect to podcasting, I think, is that the reality is it is a numbers game. As much as you might not want to focus on the numbers, it is.
Unfortunately, yeah. I
And
mean, you got to hit
that's,
certain things. So,
well, it's like if you come into this and you're a celebrity, right, and you've already got a following, then you're already going to have a podcast audience, right?
oh, it's just like a
Now,
comedian. If Chris
mhm.
Rock, for example, he announces a tour and he's going to do clubs instead of arenas. He goes to the local Chuckle Hut on a Tuesday. He's still going to pull 500 people.
Yeah,
Because of who he is. It doesn't matter. And he also can do a bad show, but it'll be good because, hey, I got to see Chris Rock. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no. Please do. I mean, you're spot on. But I think a key thing that's missing from that point is the fact that like him going and doing a comedy show elsewhere from his like normal circuit is, well, he's still doing something within his profession, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to become a podcaster, now listen, guys, anyone that's sitting and listening to this who wants to start a podcast, take notes. Okay. At the end of the day, just because you think you can do something Yeah. Doesn't mean that you can just dive headfirst into it without a plan. Okay. I've seen so many podcasts come and go over the years, and mine kept going. And that's not because I'm some amazing guy, wizard that's doing something different to you. The difference is I have a plan and I stick to it, and I take criticism on board and I factor that in and I make sure that the show gets better as a result of that. Right. Now, a key thing as well is I do occasionally, and I hate the sound of my own voice, but I do occasionally sit and listen while I'm editing and just kind of see, like, is this something I would want to listen to? Is there something from this that's in any way enjoyable or just worthy of someone's time? Now, and again, that's subjective. You know, I realize there'll probably be people that listen to this and think this show's shit. Why would I listen to this crap? And that's fine, right? But I know that there's at least 20, 30 people out there that listen to this show each and every week because there is some structure to it, because there's a certain degree of a promise. And I think any good show has like, okay, this is what you can expect. This is what you'll get each and every time. It might be a bit different each and every time, but fundamentally, this is what you'll get. And say, like, when I'm trying to sell the show or promote it to people, I'll always say things like, it's about sharing life stories. It's about going at length on particular topics and getting a good discussion going. And I'd like to think over the last 225 episodes that we've achieved that.
And that was actually one thing I wanted to say up at the top is, first of all, congratulations, the fact that you're still doing this, because
Thanks, sir.
I have listened and, I will pick up a podcast, I'll listen to it for a period of time, and then I will lose interest. I'll move on. Not my thing. And you hit it on the head about, would somebody else want to listen to this? And there is, you talk about having a plan, and I'm going to kind of go against you a little bit here.
Go for it.
And it's not that my podcast doesn't have a plan. We actually have a very regimented, we have this segment, this segment, this segment, this segment. Mm-hmm. But over the course of a given podcast, and my podcast is about movies, we will, and they're 80s movies, which is the time frame that myself and my podcast host grew up in. We will catch on a topic in the middle of the podcast and kind of go on a tangent that relates to what was in our lives at that time, or our experience with a similar thing, which I think is some of the better things. But you're absolutely right about having a plan. And there's this great thing from, are you familiar with Orange is the New Black?
Yeah, the series that had quite a few different it's like an all-female cast for the most part, wasn't it? Female prison.
Yeah, it was in jail,
yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Minimum security prison. But at one point, somebody had a podcast in the show, and it wasn't one of the characters in prison. It was one of the characters that was outside of prison. And somebody was talking to them about that. And I actually took a screenshot of it because I thought it was so funny. And the thing was, will you please stop pretending that podcasting is a job? And if you've never done a podcast, before I started my own podcast, I'd been on several podcasts as a guest. Right. First of all, being a guest on a podcast, completely different thing than actually having a podcast. And you, like myself, we are not just on the podcast, we're also the producers of the podcast. We are the ones who do all the planning, all the organizing. We do the editing. If appropriate, we do promotion. My podcast, we don't promote, which we'll get into a little bit later. But these are all things. And, I don't know if we just want to pivot into it now, but one of the things that I was thinking about is actually, let me finish my point first. So many people start podcasts and they think it's easy. All I need is a mic, or not even have a mic. I just have my computer and maybe headphones. And, we had some technical difficulties that were my fault on the start of this. And I've been doing this for a couple of years, but that's because I changed my equipment because I'm in a different location. But maybe that first, that second, even that third podcast is going to be great because, this is something new. You're so jazzed, you're so energized, and it has this kind of feeling to it. But once you get beyond that initial kind of inertia of starting, you're going to run out of things if you do not have that plan, if you do not have a direction to go in, if you do not have a lot to say, because honestly, none of us are that interesting to fill 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours a week just based on our individual lives. You need to have something, and yours is very different because you have a guest-based podcast, which is a completely different scenario than mine. We're coming up on 200 podcasts. We're a little bit shy. I think we're about 180 right now. We've had, I think, a total of 5 guests. We usually do it we've had Thanksgiving shows and then Christmas shows. And then I am a big believer in, you want to make sure you put out content every week, no matter what that content happens to be. There have been times when my podcast partner has been unavailable. So I've brought in my wife or one of my kids and done an offshoot, a movie that my podcast partner and I wouldn't have done. Or for example, in 2 weeks, I will be in the woods in northern Wisconsin and we will have no power, no running water. And we record a podcast up there. I bring up portable equipment and it's not the same thing. It's not a 2.5 hour podcast. It's a 45 minute, it's a little bit more narrowly structured, but I'm a firm believer in always putting out that content. But of the guests we've had where it has been more than 2 people, it introduces an uncontrollable element to the situation. And your show every week is an uncontrollable element because you do not have unless you have somebody on consistently, unless you have a consistent conversation base, a rapport that you've built with somebody over time, you don't know how it's going to go. You're walking into the lion's den of, and I'm not talking about the adult bookstore, which you probably don't have those in Great Britain, but that's a big adult bookstore here, the Lion's Den. But the lost my point.
Learn something new every day. Make note.
But you don't know how they're going to be. You don't know what they're, and the worst thing you can have, and you are great about drawing things out of people. And you think with your podcast, people are on there because they want to be on there, whether they're promoting something, they're promoting themselves, they're promoting a project, a podcast, whatever it happens to be. They have a vested interest in being there because you are going to bring them exposure. So it's not a selfless gesture a lot of the time that they're on the podcast. But when somebody is just guesting for whatever, I think a thing that takes a lot of people by surprise when it comes to doing a podcast like mine is how much prep work, even as a guest, there is. It's not nearly as much as there is as a producer, but as a guest for a movie podcast. So just, we talked about this a little, and I did listen to our last podcast back just to make sure it's like, am I completely wasting my time here? But so most 80s movies are somewhere in like the 90-hour, 40-minute range. If you had to guess, how much prep work do you think I would have to do each week before I actually do the podcast itself?
10 hours?
That's about right. It's a little low. It's about 12.
Yeah.
Because I listened to the last week's podcast twice. And I listened to it once. Just, okay, is there anything I said that I shouldn't have said that I have to cut that's going to cause me to lose my job? But then also look for, mistakes we made, things that we said we'd come back to that we will address in the beginning of the podcast. Then you have to watch the movie, and you can't watch the movie in real time because, you got to take notes on the movie. So it takes about double the time to actually watch the movie. And since we're movie based, we have a lot of clips, have to edit the clips, have to do all this kind of stuff. And you're a musician, you're a singer, right? I cannot sing. But that does not stop me from singing on the podcast. And that is kind of one of the things that my partner brought to it, because he is a little bit more talented in some areas than I do. But when you realize you have a deficit in something, I'm tone deaf. I from a creative perspective, I think I can write lyrics, but I can't carry a tune. And despite that, I lean into it every week that it's my week. I write a parody song for the intro to our films, and some of them are just god awful, but I kind of steer into it. I'm bad at singing. I accept that. I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to always try and offer something a little bit different each and every week where possible. There's a few points I want to touch on there. Obviously you mentioned the fact that, there has to be prep on both sides. I agree. Although with my show, I deliberately don't tell my guests anything. I say, like, if you really want to know, go check out, have a listen, and that'll give you an idea. But I like to kind of take on the responsibility of that. And because I feel like it is kind of my responsibility, like, I think it's different with a show like yours because you're coming on there, and in order to participate in the conversation, you need to have done the homework, watch the film, know what's going to come up. You know what I'm saying? But there's shows I've been on where like you feel like an afterthought, which is the guest should never feel like an afterthought. It should be like a special thing.
Sure, certainly, yes.
Yeah, and for me, that's always key. That's one of the reasons why I talk less now. Part of that is to do with feedback, but it's also because I feel like, okay, if the main event is your guest and your guest is like the afterthought, then you're not really delivering that main event, are you? You're like, no one wants to sit and listen to you talk, and like your guest is in the background somewhere. It just doesn't make sense to me. So I went and made my own show elsewhere from here on Patreon, where it's just me talking. But what's interesting is it's the exact same level of research, if not more. I have to do more planning and research for that show. Whereas this show, I write down some notes, I got some ideas, but the main thing I'm focused on is, can I have a conversation with this person? You mentioned before about the fact that, like, it's an uncontrollable element. You don't know how that situation is going to go. And you're absolutely right. Unless it's a returning guest like yourself, where I know I've had a good conversation before, stepping out into the unknown, man. But I kind of believe that that's what life is. That's what life should be. You should put yourself in situations that are a bit different, that get different things out of you, because you don't know what you're going to stumble across. You mentioned before your show, like it goes up to like 2 hours, but sometimes you do 45 minutes, you do sometimes smaller shows, etc. In that, you might find that, okay, I'm going to experiment with this level of time for my show. Like I did that. Like when I first started the show, it was all over the place. 1 week it's 2.5 hours, the next week it's 45 minutes. Like there's not a lot of consistency there. And I think as a listener, it's overwhelming to see like, oh, there's all these shows, but then there's no like consistency in it. Like, oh, and I know for anyone that's joining the show now, 225 episodes, it's like, oh my God, where do I even start? Right. And I always just tell them, like, listen to the latest episode and go from there, because that's the most like
the
of
current,
now. But yeah,
this is what the now is. This is what and I've listened to older podcasts every now and then. When I run out of things in my podcast feed, every now and then I'll go back and I'll cherry pick something. Some of it is, it's a learning experience. It is where have I gotten to? And when you listen to our first podcasts versus our 50th podcast versus our 100th podcast.
I'll just interject now. So the show's called the Betamax Review, for anyone wondering.
Betamax Rewind.
You've changed Rewind. You've changed.
No, it's always, you actually got that wrong last time too. It's Betamax Rewind.
Oh, I feel so bad now.
It's all right. I actually caught that on the re-listen.
Oh, that's pain, man. Okay, well, that's my first strike.
That's
first strike. There we go. Betamax Rewind.
But the quality of the sound, first of all, started off with very, very basic equipment, and then have upgraded over time to better sounding equipment, because honestly, the better it sounds, the easier it is to overcome other shortcomings you might have. In addition to that, there is just the actual quality of what we're saying has improved. And I know, and this is a thing that I used to be a public speaker. I used to teach how to use software. And I also used to interview people a lot for jobs. And one of the things I used to do when I was interviewing someone on the phone, and I knew it was just never going to go anywhere, because a lot of times in the first 2-3 minutes of an interview, this is a non-starter, but you can't just say, yeah, we're not hiring you, sorry. So you still go through the process, because every now and then somebody will bring you back. Everybody will actually surprise you in that back end. But usually you can just tell in the beginning if somebody's completely a non-starter. But when I'd be doing this on the phone and I knew it wasn't going anywhere, I'd still go through the process, but I would make a little tick sheet and I'd look for their verbal tick. I'd look for their verbal crutch. Is it mine is so. When I am trying to bridge thoughts together, a lot of times I will use so or and as mine. And I'm aware of it, but I still do it. And I try to, and I should have a thing printed up right above, but like can be a verbal crutch that you see with a lot of younger people. And there's a basketball player, I don't remember which basketball player it was, but in the course of a 30-second interview, He said like 37 times. And a lot of people, once you tell them that they have this verbal crutch, it gets into their head and they start doing it less. But until you do that, and how many people listen to themselves? Because a lot of people don't have the ability. They don't have this forum, if you will, where they can go back and do it. But you had said that when somebody asks, where should I start? You say, start at the latest one, because that's where you are now. That's what your podcast is now. And with my podcast, it's so hard to say because the show we were is not the show we are.
Right.
But there's a lot of callbacks and continuously running gags or bits, if you will, of things that we will reference that happened over and over and over again. I'll give you an example, something that's really, really dumb. I'm sure you're familiar with the film Armageddon.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a great film. I enjoy it, but it's not a great film. That film makes me cry every time I watch it.
Is that bad?
No. There's this scene in it where one of the guys who is going up into space to mine the asteroid to save the Earth goes and visits his either ex-wife or ex-girlfriend, and they have a kid together. And she tells the kid that the guy's a salesman. And then when he's going up into space and they're showing all of them, the kid says, that salesman's on the TV, and she drops the phone and she walks over and she says, that man's not a salesman. He's your daddy. And it's like, even talking about it, it gets me choked up. And but it's so silly, but it's just a thing that it's one of those things that we will constantly, and that man's your daddy. We'll just say that man's your daddy. Or another huge one is whenever somebody's in a plane, it spun out into the Sea of Japan, there were no survivors, which is from MASH, when Henry Blake died, which it's just such a completely random thing, but it's been referenced so many times that you won't necessarily get the context, especially if you are not my age, but if you're your age. If we have younger listeners, they're not going to get a lot of the cultural things that some of the older people will get.
Well, this speaks to the idea of like casual fans versus like your core fans. I mean, this is something that I've come across over the last couple of years with my live streams that I do online, where I've got like this core community that's been following me over the years and has checked out my various projects, my acting, voice acting, podcasting, content creation, all that, music, whatever. You've got that core community who remember those things from years ago, and then you've got the new people that maybe don't appreciate that. And I feel like, yeah, sometimes you might be left out a little bit with certain references and stuff, but as long as the whole show isn't that, because if it's like a whole show of those and you just don't know, then what's the point of listening, right? Unless you're a core listener. So there's always kind of got to be a nice balance, I think, of catering to your older core community, core listeners, and then also trying to provide something that's going to entice new people in. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it depends. It depends on a lot of factors, really. I don't. I will say this though, with the whole tick thing, I'm not as fussy about that. Like my show, for example, isn't edited. I don't cut out ifs, ats, all that stuff.
No, I don't either.
Yeah, but the thing is, I know there's a lot of people that do that, and I'll cut stuff out. Like, for instance, that bit of dialogue,
internet hiccup, sure.
Yeah, I'll cut stuff out like that. But when it's just like people talking, I like that element. I like this show to feel almost like like a fascinating conversation between two people that, maybe you could be sitting at a bar and you're listening to two people talking. You just happen to not chip in, but you're enjoying the conversation. That's the way I like to look at it.
A girl that I used to work with just happened to Google me, or somehow she found out I had a podcast because
it's always dangerous, isn't it?
And this is a good friend of mine, but we no longer work together, families, right, etc. You drift apart, and it's not anything personal, but she started texting me, "Hey, I found your podcast. I'm listening to it." And it's interesting to get that kind of outsider's perspective from somebody who doesn't know both of us. They just know me. But one of the things she said, and it talks to what you just said, is she feels like listening to my podcast is she's sitting in on a conversation with a couple of friends.
Right.
And my wife said something which I don't know how to take exactly. She said that, well, when you're dead, I have a couple hundred hours of, you talking to listen to. She probably said it nicer than that, but that was the general feeling of it. And I did say congratulations at the top because so many podcasts come and go. The number of podcasts that hit 10 is probably this percentage, 20, 50, 100. Once you hit 100, there's very, very few podcasts that hit that threshold because it wasn't what they thought it was going to be, or it's more work, or they just moved on to something else.
Well, it's like what you said earlier. I'm going to disagree with that. When someone says podcasting is not a job, I thoroughly disagree with that. If you ever start a podcast, if you happen to be listening and you've either been involved with a podcast or you do a podcast, you'll know exactly what I mean. It is definitely a job. There is so much time that goes into creating it. This right here, what we're doing now, this is the easy bit. It's all other
absolutely
the stuff afterwards, the editing, the social media, and it's thankless. Look, I mean, we've both been doing our shows for some time, and I never really thought about quitting, but I have kind of thought about reducing it or whatever. I've got frustrated at it at times, but look, the end of the day in life, when you're pursuing things where there's so much competition, like acting, podcasting, etc., the reality is, you just kind of got to keep throwing yourself out there and hope for the best. And you might not make it. I set myself a personal goal. I've said this before a million times, so apologies for repeating this, but I set myself a goal of 10 years. We've got to 3. I thought it'd kind of be cool to do like a decade, because I started in 2020. It's 2023 now. Let's see where we're at in 2030. And that's kind of my mindset. And so I didn't pay as much attention to the numbers anymore. I was like, let's just keep going. Let's just see how this evolves. Let's see how I change. And it's that, I think, is, if nothing else, like I remember a friend of mine, shout out to Childish Jacko, he said this a while back, and we did projects together. I think
you've had him on the podcast a couple times.
Only once, actually.
Was it only once? Because I know I listened to that one.
Yeah, I'm trying to get him back on the show, actually. So yeah, I hope he hears this. But anyway, he said to me, remember that what you're doing now is like a time capsule. It's like, this is you in this moment, and it'll never be something that was a waste of time. It'll always be valuable on some level. And you mentioned there, like your wife has a version of you that exists for all time. And that's kind of amazing when you think about it. And then I think the bigger thing for me was when I realized this show is bigger than myself, when it became about sharing people's stories, sharing something of value that people can be inspired by or get some entertainment from or get them thinking. That's when I was like, that's what this is. And then it doesn't matter anymore. Like, yeah, okay, sure, it'd be great to have thousands of hits or whatever, or get sponsors. And look, I'm still trying to get those dreams. I'm trying to follow those dreams. I'd love to have a studio. I'd love to have physical guests. I'd love all that, I'd love to be in major movies, but we can't always have what we want, but we can keep trying and chasing the dreams anyway. But what you said there about how only a certain amount gets to this number before they give up, I think it does take a certain amount of maybe stubbornness, or maybe just having a mindset of not quitting, or a certain degree of enjoyment as well. Like if it's
you're an actor, it is similar that very few people who are successful actors just go on their first audition,
right,
get their first job, then they're on a regular on a TV show, then they get a Marvel movie. It happens for some people, but most people, there's a grind. There is the paying your dues, if you will. And a lot of that is being able to deal with both overt and not overt rejection. And that rejection might be, no, we don't want you for this role. Or it might be, my podcast listenership isn't as much as I hoped it would be. But then there's also the acceptance. And I think you guys have golf there, right? Because wasn't golf born in the UK?
That's a good question. I don't know. Maybe Scotland. Could
Scotland,
be.
yeah.
Maybe St
But
Andrews.
golf is one of those sports where I golf. I have not golfed in years, but I used to golf. Golf is weird because you can go out and you just suck. You will be hacking up the course, you will be having a terrible day, and you'll be on the 15th hole, and you are ready to just leave your clubs on the side of the course and go home. And you will hit a 20-foot putt, or you'll hit a great chip shot, or you'll have a drive that puts you within 5 feet of the cup. And none of the rest of that stuff matters. You get that one little taste of success that makes the difference. It makes you forget all the negativity that came before it. And that's what there are. I'm sure in your history of podcasts, there are ones that you've walked away when you've been done with it and said, that was not my best work. And it's not necessarily you, but it sometimes it's just the stars aren't aligned and it's not working. And we had one of those recently, and it was a bad movie. But even beyond that, bad movies can lead to great podcasts because a lot of times they're fodder that you can exploit because of why they're bad. But there was just something that was off that night, and the podcast just didn't work. And we get done, and you know how this works, where you talk before, then you start, then you say, okay, good night, everybody. And then you hang out for like another minute or so to do any kind of wrap up stuff you need to do. And we were done. It's like, that was not our best work. And I feel like quitting right now, but you're not going to. And, you said you set a goal of 10 years.
Yeah.
About a year and a half ago, I said I was going to do 200 podcasts. That was kind of like my cutoff. I was going to do 200 and out. As I said, we're sitting at about 180 right now. So that's basically 4.5 months, not even to the end of the year, I don't think, before we hit 200. I cannot imagine quitting at this point.
Right.
Because I moved to where I live now. I live in Ohio. I grew up in Wisconsin, but I moved to Ohio 27 years ago. So now more than half my life I've lived here, but everything that I have here is stuff that I have picked up, people I've met, things I've experienced since I've been here. But I don't have that previous 26 years anymore, because I can't just go to the bar and hang out with these guys. I can't go and do fantasy football, American football, with my buddies. I can't do a lot of those things. And in a way, this podcast has given me that little piece of my past back to me, because I'm talking to a kid I grew up with, more or less high school, but still one of my best friends. He was in my wedding. I was an usher in his wedding. I wasn't important enough to actually be in his wedding proper, but that's a whole nother story. Well, he actually asked us when I told him I was coming on the podcast, he's like, are you going to throw me under the bus like you did last time? and I listened to the last podcast, and I didn't really throw him under the bus.
I was going to say, I would have remembered that.
But it is a thing where we started in COVID, and a lot of podcasts started in COVID. A lot of podcasts did not make it out of stay-at-home portion of COVID. But, we're not that COVID is done, but we're outside of, lockdowns and things like that. But it's become part of my routine in a way.
Right.
And I can't imagine what I would do with all the time I would get back if I didn't have this kind of time albatross of a podcast every week. And I say that jokingly because it gives me a lot of joy to do. And I don't do it for anybody besides myself, really. And I know that's very selfish. And we do things. We have, as I talked about before, we have segments. And there's this one segment that I came up with that I wanted to kill so badly because it takes so much time to do. It's so much prep work to do this one segment, which is very short. And I don't think it has the ROI for the amount of time spent. And I said, okay, at the end of this season, because we break up things into seasons, I'm going to cut this segment. And we actually had people that let us know, oh, that's my favorite segment. They could have just been screwing with me because they knew how much work it is because I've complained about it. But because of that, I've continued to do that because, if someone cares enough to listen to the show, I'm going to listen to what they have to say about the show.
Yeah. Yeah, no, dude, it's the same for me. When I think about the idea of quitting, and again, it's never really, same as you, I've never really sat there and thought, oh, I'm going to quit. Like I just never really crossed my mind. But when I get frustrated, I remember about those few people that listen to the show. And then I think about how amazing that actually is. Because the podcast, it's an hour, maybe two. That's a lot of time. And that person has sat down and listened to that. I know people that reached out to me who've, maybe they've listened to it in, half an hour here, half an hour there, but they listen to it and they're like, yeah, I like this. I like what you're doing. Keep it up. And that motivates me. And also a question I want to ask you, because I feel that this way, do you find it's a little bit addictive?
At times it is, it's a dopamine hit probably.
Yeah.
And I think that there are moments and they're stupid moments, but they're just these little moments. And you have something, if you want to go with that, so you don't forget, you can, or I can finish.
No. I was just agreeing with you. Yeah, totally.
We were talking last week, and what movie we did? Valley Girl, a Nicolas Cage film, one of Nicolas Cage's first films. We did Valley Girl. Never seen it before. And this is actually my season of unseen movies from the 80s I'd never seen before. So we're going through different movies that I had never seen before, because it's interesting to see a movie from a time period today, because there's definitely differences between films today and films then.
I feel the same about with movies, but also music as well. It's very strange. Yeah, like there was like an indie band that I was introduced to recently that would have definitely been the sort of band I would have listened to growing up in the 2000s. And it's weird because they sounded like so many other bands I was listening to, but then it's just, you just hadn't have heard of them at the time. It's intriguing.
But we were in the middle of talking about this, and I will just throw out like a non sequitur and just keep going. And usually it just will go over my podcast partner's mind. It'll probably go past the audience's mind, because it's just something so quick in a stream of consciousness that it's not going to mean anything to anybody but me, because once again, the podcast is for me because of my ego. But I referenced a bit from an Eddie Murphy comedy show. And immediately after I did it, my podcast partner did the musical bit that accompanies it, like just a cappella. And it was just so off the cuff, so completely unplanned. It was like I was in sync with him, that we had that kind of connection. And it was just, it's things like that where I'm just blown away sometimes with those little moments, those little pieces, those little victories, if you will.
I feel exactly the same. It's one of the reasons why I keep doing the show. And I remark that to my guests every once in a while, like this show, this moment, etc. Like I had a guest on recently who wrote a book about consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. And we spoke about a bunch of different things, but one thing we spoke about was this idea of like flow states, so like that could be, you're in a fast-paced job, like working at a bar. Like when I've worked at a bar before, it almost felt like I was not even thinking about it. I was just going from thing to thing, like that. And sometimes this show feels like that. Like I completely forget what I'm doing and I'm just in the moment, in the zone. And that's dangerous because you got to remember, hey, there's a show here. I can't let this go off the rails or whatever. But I don't know. I think like the biggest thing that's changed for me, and maybe this is the same for you too, is like I feel very confident about this and what I do. And when I listen to those earlier podcasts, or when I go and appear on someone's show who's just starting out, I can tell that like the confidence isn't there. And because of that, it's difficult to listen to. I mean, everyone has to start somewhere, but I think the biggest thing with like being an online persona or being a podcaster or whatever is that you have to kind of decide on like, okay, who am I as a presenter? Who am I as this? Like, how does this work for me? Will this work? Do I have to put on like a persona, or am I just myself? will I have segments or will it be more discussional based? I mean, for example, you're a former TV producer, and I feel like a lot of that probably would have maybe consciously, subconsciously gone into like how you plan the show, because you figured, well, okay, I'm doing a show, so it has to have segments, it has to be like this, and it's like it doesn't
think
have
about structure.
Yeah, but it's like, and I know a lot of shows that are like that. Like one of my favorite shows to listen to is this show, and I've said this so many times. I apologize, guys, but I love this. Go check it out. Who Are These Podcasts? It's a group of guys. They've been doing this show now for like, it's got about like 400 episodes now, and they have a lot of fun. They bash people like Stuttering John and all the Howard Stern law, Opie and Anthony, all that. And it honestly is a lot of fun. They have some outrageous moments though, so be warned. But one thing that they do that I love is that they put bad podcasts on blast. They talk about all the things that are wrong with podcasts. They have fun with it. They have jokes with it, but they kind of make you realize that like, just because you've got a big listenership doesn't mean it's a good show, which is painful sometimes. And I'm thinking like, oh man, like I'd love to have hundreds of thousands of listeners, and I can't believe they're listening to this trash. Like, why would they listen to this? And it's like sometimes, and that's the thing. If you're well known, if you're like a celebrity established, right, you can pretty much put any old slop out there and people will listen to it. And sometimes the hosts of said show will say as much. They'll be like, oh, well, we'll put out anything and you guys will listen to it. And it's like, do you know what? That might be the case for a while, but the reality of doing a show is that over time, you're going to be less relevant, right? You're not always going to be having your 15 minutes in the sunshine of just nailing it. At some point, you're going to be irrelevant. You're going to be not as interesting. And then it comes down to, well, who are you in this show? Are you actually putting something out there that's worth listening to, or are you just putting crap out there? Like, why should people check this out? And it happens. Giving Opie as an example, Opie and Anthony, for those who don't know, they did a very successful radio show in the 2000s.
I was a big fan of Opie.
Yeah, and they were great. So it's I can't remember his full names, Opie and Anthony Cumia, and they had Jim Norton, a bunch of other comedians, and I feel like very much those radio shows set the standard for what good podcasts would become years later. And there's many, many, many good podcasts out there that are more like, radio shows really, because that's where it comes from. Podcasting comes from, but not everyone chooses to do it like that. And they don't have to, because obviously on radio, you have to fill dead air. There's all these commitments you have to adhere to that you don't have to deal with podcasting. But I feel like that doesn't mean that you should not put any less effort in. And a lot of these guys that used to be on these shows, like Opie and Anthony, was so successful, and these guys were millionaires because of it. Anthony Cumia, still very successful, still does all this stuff, right? Opie, he's lucky to get like 10 listeners in like a Facebook Live. This is a guy who was on national radio in the United States, in the major markets like New York, I believe, and other states. And it's like, at one point when he started, right, when he came off all of this and he was just starting, he had about 100,000 listeners for his respective podcast, right? And then over time, he's mismanaged that, put his audience off, and now it's down to like 10 people if he's lucky. And think about it. At one time, household name, now nothing. Now, that can change, and I understand that he's putting the efforts in to try and change that now. But at the end of the day, you can't just bank on like name recognition or your brand forever. Sooner or later, it's going to come down to, is this show good or not? That's the fundamentals of it. And having a structured show, having segments, caring about what you put out there is the most important thing. I've recorded shows before, and I'll probably sound like a broken record saying this because I've said it before, but I've done shows where I sat down, I recorded it, I thought, this is trash, I refuse to put this out, and I didn't put it out. And that's an hour of my life I'll never get back.
Wow. But I've never done that. I should have done that with Raging Bull, because that was such a shit show. But you mentioned Opie.
Please tell me more. Whoa. What's Raging Bull?
Raging Bull, the movie, Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci. It was
really? Oh, mad.
It was just, the podcast was just bad. And it wasn't bad. We've had one of our worst podcasts is actually one of our most fun podcasts to listen to. And that is the Tango and Cash one. And I'm so hammered by the end of it that I can't even speak. And,
so you went on top of things. And
I'm running the board while I'm doing this. So is a shit show. But you mentioned Opie and Anthony, and you
Right.
mentioned Jim Norton. Jim Norton has, and they've been on break for a while, but he has this show called the Chip Chipperson Show.
Mhm.
I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a podcast.
No, but I'm familiar with Jim. I know that they all do different like shows together, and sometimes like so they done like Sirius XM and stuff like that. Like
Right.
they collaborate a lot basically.
But he has this podcast that he does that he's doing a character for the entire podcast. He's not Jim Norton. He's actually this character the entire time. And once you get it, once it clicks in your head, what it actually is trying to do, it's brilliant. And it's one of the few podcasts that I listen to regularly, and I don't miss an episode when that one comes out. But you mentioned flow, and
Right.
you also mentioned, confidence. First of all, flow and flow state. I went to a conference about that 2 years ago. So it's very, very big in project management and
Right. Yeah.
managing things. But
Sure, you love those buzzwords, don't you? In the business context. All right. You owe me a big one for this because you're having to make me edit, you bastard.
you just said you don't edit. Just leave it in. It'll
I
be
can't.
very
No,
interesting.
because it just cuts off, and then suddenly we're just chat. Like, obviously, something's happened. Yeah, there was a power outage on Matthew's side, and I hate editing. I'm just making a big deal. It's not a big deal.
I've been a very problematic guest this time. I mean, compared to last time,
I'm kidding. Man,
much
it's
more
fine.
problems than last time. So
I will. Do you know? I will say though. I think it's interesting because it's quite. In terms of the conversation we've been having about podcasting and broadcasting and the way things happen and how it's different every time, it is kind of quite spot on. It happens. I had a show not long ago, it's about 10 episodes back, where I completely lost all video. It caught like most of my video, but start, got basically none of my guests' video. But I had all the audio, and of course, audio is king. Like it's a podcast, people forget this as well when they're doing their show, because I know there's a lot of people that listen to my show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc., and Spotify. And yeah, there is a video version, but you do have to think about the fact that it is audio. It's it comes from radio, and I think a lot of people tend to forget that. And obviously, we were on the topic of Opie and Anthony and Jim Norton and all these people, and it's like I think those guys. They'll always hopefully understand that it's about how you structure the show and what you put out there. And yes, you don't have to deal with the adverts anymore. Yeah, you don't have to worry about filling dead space or whatever, but you do have to have a back and forth there. Like I like to think of this like if this was on the radio, this would have been an interview discussion in pretty much the exact same way, except maybe every now and again we cut to commercial. But it still would follow the same principle. Like I treat it in the same manner. And I think people should, and when they don't, that's when your show tends to fail. And, it's interesting. I've seen shows come and go that, they got the numbers. I might have even appeared on the show and they were doing really well. And then they just stopped. And I don't know why. They were getting everything. They're ticking all the boxes. But I guess for them, the love just wasn't there, or they just, I don't know, they weren't reaching their goals. And it makes me laugh because like, yeah, there's been times when I've had massive dips in the show. Like I remember it went from like the standard like 30 views per episode or whatever it was, right down to like 10, 5 if I'm lucky. And it was brutal because this was like 2 years in, and I was like, damn, man, like what am I
do you
doing
find
wrong?
that that's due to like what it is you're talking about, or is it so you can't like pinpoint? I find some of our peaks and valleys are based on what it is. If we're doing a like a banger of a film, if we're doing a Top Gun, we're going to draw a lot more than if we're doing an obscure film.
Okay, so here's the thing. With my show, because I'm the same as you, business mind, I look for patterns, I look for these things, and that's where the frustration bores for me. That comes from me, because if it was a topic-based show and I was just doing some topics that just aren't as interesting, I fully accept the fact that like those episodes would just not get as many views, and that's fine. And again, I don't sit there and constantly look at the numbers, but at the same time, I do get a bit frustrated because the show is an interview-based show, and I suppose the draw is the guest, but then people don't always know the guest. and I suppose in many ways I'm banking on the idea of like my own name value, and then also, which is ironic considering what I said earlier, but this idea that people might see me potentially as a good interviewer or a good broadcaster or something. That's what I'm hoping. Like when people see me on Twitch or TikTok, or they see maybe a film that I've done or something, and then they look at my other work and they go, okay, he's trying to create these different properties. I know what to expect with this guy. I'm going to check it out. That's my hope. But I realize that's banking on a lot. I have had shows which have been on specific topics and they've done massively better than just my guest only shows. And, you know, I thought about changing this show into a topic only, but right now it's just open to anyone and everyone. So for example, it's not just that. I think that's the misconception about my show as well. Like, I'll have anyone on. If you're willing to have a good conversation and you're not hateful person.
So you haven't turned anybody down. You haven't had anybody reach out to you and
didn't say that.
Okay.
I said, what I'm saying is, like, I'm willing to pretty much have anyone on so long as like I know they can have a good conversation with me and I know that they're not hateful in some way. Because you can have people on the show and they won't really know how to act on a podcast, which that sounds douchey. I realize that, but like we've all had that.
There's validity to it though. I mean, there really is. Because
I'll give you a really good example before we get into your stand-up, right? Because I know you're a comedian and I know it's a valid point. I just want to share this one thing. Like, you spoke about, like, have you ever done any bad shows? Yes, right? But there's a particular one that I put out that I feel like I shouldn't have put out. It was a long time ago. It's probably like a year and a half ago now. And it was like an author or something. I had him on the show and he was just giving me nothing. And I don't mean that you have to make a big song and dance and be like, oh, aren't I amazing? I do this, I do that. That's never what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is, if I ask you a question, you give me an answer, right? But like, you give me like a proper answer. It's like, for instance, if I come up to you in the street and I say, hey, how are you? And you go, I'm fine. Right? People were never wanting just, I'm fine. They want to get something started. They want to, like, the whole point of trying to get a conversation going is, you want to expand upon it. Now, you can make the counter argument, or ask better questions then. And that's a fair argument. But at the same time, there has to be a willingness. You know, and we've all been in that scenario where you're having a conversation with someone and you're trying to get it started and they keep giving you one word answers. Like, yeah, it's fine. Yeah, I did this. Yeah. And you're just like, well, fuck me, man. Like, what? Why are you here? Why are you on this show? And of course, it's like, oh, I want to promote myself. And it's like I remember one time I had a guest on my show who, and I said this before, but it just outrages me. Like, they were trying to promote this book and these things they do, their services. And I said to them, like, okay, what's the first bit of advice you'd give to someone if they were, you know, trying to seek, I think it was like mental health or something, right? And their first suggestion, number one, first thing you do is, I'd tell them to go to my website and check out these links. And I'm like, really? That's the first thing you do? Like, I didn't say it at the time, but I was like, really? Like, I get that you're trying to promote yourself, but fuck me, man. Like, now I'm just unfiltered now. Normally this is me on my other show, my Patreon show, but here it is. Here's the real me. Unfiltered, don't give a fuck.
See, I would argue when you go up to somebody on the street.
Okay, well, that's an extreme example, but my point is...
But when you ask someone, it's like, hey, how's it going? Oh, you know, my sciatica's acting up.
All right. I get you.
That's a greeting you give out of just human decency.
Okay, fine. Let's because you're picking up my words, right? Let's say I come up to you, we're buddies, we haven't seen each other in a while, right? And I say to you, how's the job going? And you say, yeah, fine, good. Right. I want you to expand upon that. I understand hi, how are you is not necessarily that can just be a hello. I get it. Right. We're like that in the UK. It's fine. I don't think anyone really expects you to start talking about like the last 6 months and how terrible it's been for you and how your mum's in hospital and all this shit. And it's like, I get that. I understand that.
Okay.
But at the same time, if we're having a proper conversation or we're trying to, I want to know, like, well, how's it been for the last 2 years since I last saw you? And you're just giving me, yeah, you know, fine. Same old. Yeah. I'm like, let's just see you later, you know? Let's not have a conversation then.
The interesting thing is, and I'm surprised that, and I guess I feel a little bit less special that you'll have anybody on your podcast. I thought it's like, hey, actually,
Again, I didn't mean it in that way. What I mean, and
no, I
again,
get it.
I must reiterate this. I'm looking for someone who's willing to have a good conversation. When I say that, what I mean is I think a lot of people assume like, oh, I need to, because I've had a lot of people say like, oh, I'd be on your show, but I'm not doing anything, or oh, I'm not like special like your other guest. I'm not doing X, Y, and Z. And it's like, it's not about I'm doing this really special thing, or I have this really amazing career, or whatever. Everyone has something to offer. Everyone has value. That's what I'm trying to illustrate as a point. You can have a good conversation with anyone, but they have to be willing to have a good conversation with you. And that is my point.
That was the thing that really scared me about the first time I was coming on your podcast, was because I was looking at your guest list and I was looking at your subjects that you guys were talking about.
Right.
And everybody had like this SME area, the subject matter expert area. They had something that they were a person that was an expert on something. And I was doing some internal, looking at myself and realized, okay, I do this, I've done that, but I'm not really an expert at anything. I'm kind of all over the place. Same. And that was kind of the concern of what am I going to bring to your podcast? Because just like I don't want somebody to come on my show and not bring value. The few times that I do guest spots on other podcasts, I want to make sure I'm bringing value to their podcast, because I don't want to be a net negative. I don't want to be something that's drawing down, their energy, their listenership, their viewership. I want to be something that if nothing else, they are no better, no worse than they were before I came into their little sphere.
I totally agree, dude. I mean, I think if anything, it sounds like we both suffer from this whole not really thinking a lot of oneself problem, or maybe imposter syndrome. I don't know, because I'm exactly the same. Like I might be confident, but believe me, I doubt myself all the time. Like whenever someone has me on their show, I'm like, what the fuck are they going to ask me? I've got nothing going on. I'm like a failing, struggling actor who can barely get 5 people to pay attention to him at any one time, and never been anything you've ever even heard of, and can't even fucking find a job right now. Like, why the fuck would you want me on your show? Like, for what purpose would you want me on your show?
But I'll give you a little tidbit that'll make you feel better.
Yeah.
So after I was on your podcast last time, 2.5 years ago, I think it was in March of 2021.
April 3rd, okay. 2021, episode 82.
Is that when you published, or is that when we did it?
That's when published.
Okay, so it would have been March.
Okay.
Because and the reason I say that is because I was writing I started my new contract April 2nd or April 3rd. Right. And I had mentioned that I was starting a new contract, and that's how I could place where it was. But unlike your podcast, or excuse me, unlike my podcast, when I was on your podcast, I actually went out to my Facebook feed and I put links into it for people to go see it. I don't do that with my podcast. And that's because your podcast circle includes lots of people. And a lot of the people that are in my podcast circle are people that do not need to hear my podcast, my regular podcast. Because, and it's not that I'm embarrassed about it at all. I'm 100% not embarrassed. My mother has asked me, should I listen to your podcast? And I said, no, you shouldn't. And well, why shouldn't I listen to it? It's like, Mom, I talk about, how do I put this? I talk about eating pussy a lot on the podcast, and
I did really not expect that. I did not expect that. Wow. Okay.
So, there's certain things, certain groups, and, you also try to have like this professionalism about it. But I went on and I posted links to it, and I had a lot of comments from female friends of mine. Who is this guy? How can I meet this guy? He looks like a model. You look like a goblin. I mean, there's this difference. There was a lot of interest from the female side of, I'd love to meet this guy. So, well, you're on the wrong continent.
Matthew, is that what you're saying? Player.
Even back in the day, no.
I don't believe that.
No, and when you do a video podcast, we talked about how everything's kind of a time capsule.
Mm-hmm.
When I look at this podcast, when you publish it. And I look at it, the last one, just how much older I look in 2.5 years. And my wife actually said, aren't you going to shave your beard before you do it? Because it makes you look so much older. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I'm this age. It is what it is. And honestly, for her sake, the worse I look, the better it is for her. Because,
how's that work?
Well, if you are my podcast partner, he talked about he had to stop wearing his wedding ring for a period of time because of his he's a bug guy. He does I want to say taxidermy, but that's not right. He kills bugs.
Exterminator.
There you go. But he deals with a lot of chemicals, and for reasons he had to stop wearing his ring for a while because of some chemical thing, I think it was. And I don't wear a wedding ring. So I wore a wedding ring for the first year that we were married. That was the agreement. I would wear it for the first year, and that's it. I don't wear I wear a watch now, but I never wore a watch either. The only reason I wear a watch is because it's a quick way for me to get my text messages, for me to see my calendar, stuff like that. I don't wear anything other than, clothes usually. And he said, so now that I'm not going to be wearing a wedding ring, I'm going to have women coming up to me all the time. I'm like, no, that is not how it works at all. The wedding ring brings, the women to the yard. I mean, having a wedding ring is not something that is going to turn women off. It's going to be more likely to turn them on. And
it's fascinating, that, isn't it? The reverse psychology thing. Because I've noticed like when I've been in relationships, right now I'm single, and it's like I don't exist to women, right? But when I've been in relationships, it's been like, oh, suddenly now you're interested. Oh, that's typical. But then I suppose you give off a different energy, don't you?
You give off a different energy, and it's also, if somebody else wants that person, they have to have something that you don't know about. And one of the things I've always said with my wife is, my wife and I met at work, not where I work anymore, but where I worked at the time. And we couldn't be more different. And when people found out that we were just dating at first, before we got married, a lot of people were, I don't see it. I don't get it. But that also raised that kind of interest. It's like, well, he's got to have something for her to be interested in him. I don't know what it is. And it's like, well, I don't have money. I don't know. What was I bringing to the table? And that's a question I still can't figure out, what it is I bring to the table, because she brought so much to the table. She brings so much more to the table than I do. She is definitely, in every relationship, there's a winner and there's a loser, I think. And I think it changes over time. Sometimes you might be the winner in the relationship. Sometimes you might be the loser in the relationship. I am the winner in this relationship. I've always been the winner in this relationship. She has always been the loser in this relationship. And nothing is more symbolic of that is when you're in high school, at least in the US, one of the dreams, one of those things you can say was successful is, I dated the prom queen, or I dated the homecoming queen. I married the homecoming queen. She married a guy who was third chair on the chess team. So, I mean, I won that battle. She did not win that battle. And she's more successful than me. She's more social than me. I really don't bring a lot to the table, but she still loves me, which is all I can ask for.
What is it, do you think, that she fell for? I mean, must be your personality, your confidence,
I have, I'm just like one of those people. It's like George Costanza. If you're familiar with Seinfeld at all.
I want to say no, but I'm familiar with Seinfeld.
All right. So in one of the episodes, George's whole thing was he just had to meet someone 3 times, because by the 3rd time, you just kind of get stuck in their head like an earworm. And that's kind of how I always saw myself, is when you first meet me or you first see me, there's not an appeal there. There's not something that is drawing you to them. But after that multiple times exposure, it's like the radiation sets in and they get infected. And I think that's what it is after a period of time, there's just something about probably my personality, because it takes a while for it to click. And, even after we were dating, we were at a club. We were at a bar watching a band called Warrant. Probably never heard of it. They had a big hit, Cherry Pie, which if you ever go to a strip club, you will hear.
Mm.
But they were big in the late 80s. And we saw them at this club actually where the guitarist for, I want to say Primus, but the guitarist for Pantera was killed at this bar.
Man, done by Daryl.
But we were at this bar on my birthday, and she took me because she had no desire to see this band, and I was just blotto. And I was just doing, we've been together like 3 months at this time, and I was doing my normal spiel, my normal bullshit that I do. And it's like, well, when we break up, you'll always remember the fact that you saw this band at this shitty little bar. And she got really, really upset. So I don't understand why you always say things like that when we break up, when this is happening, when it's over. And then it just clicked in her head. She got my personality at that point, that, like you said before, you and I have this thing where we have a lot of self-doubt or imposter syndrome. And a lot of that I have always put off in the way I talk to people. And you see that it's a defense mechanism, because you say certain things to push that person away, or not even push them away, but to keep them at arm's length. But once they get past that, once they see through that, then they kind of get into your inner circle, if you will.
Well, I think there's something to be said for, putting yourself down and that being kind of, what's the word? Like a repellent. Like, it's going to put people off if you're constantly down about yourself. But at the same time, I suppose it can be endearing in some cases. But it's interesting, because I'd say one difference between yourself and myself is that while we both might be self-deprecating, I do recognize that I have to a lot of the time keep it to myself.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I do as well.
Right. But the thing is, like, when you're talking about yourself and I'm like, I don't know, I think this guy's pretty great. I don't know. Like, don't be so hard on yourself, man. I feel like it's a confidence issue.
Oh no. And a lot of it's self-deprecating. And
right.
When I was younger, I think I believed it more than I do now. I'm very, very comfortable with who I am. I accept my shortcomings. I know that I have shortcomings. I know what a lot of my shortcomings are. And some of them I try to work on. Some of them I just accept as, well, that's who I am.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things about getting older, both personally and professionally and always, is acceptance and acknowledgement of who you are, who you can be, who you want to be. And it was probably due to my wife that I got to a point totally where I'm so okay with who I am. And when I was younger, when I was growing up, I can give my favorite teacher I ever had, my fourth grade teacher. He was somebody who, he always thought that I was destined to do great things. And I didn't know about that. But I remember I saw him. It was right before I moved to Ohio, because right before I got the job that moved me to Ohio. And I was working as a salesman in the equivalent of like a furniture store, except they sold televisions and stuff. And I was working in their computer department. And he saw me, and he just, the look of disgust and disappointment in his face. And he didn't even want to talk to me. And this is a guy that I consider to be a friend, in addition to the fact that he was my fourth grade teacher. And I have kept in contact with him since then. He said, Matt, you can do great things. You can do good things. You have to decide to do them. And if you don't, you're just letting yourself down. And if you can live with that, that's great. And he wasn't wrong. I mean, I wasn't living up to my potential, but that was the thing when I was a kid, it was always, you can do this. You are expected to do this. And I'd go back home or back to class reunions or be hanging out with people that I grew up with. And there was always is he living up to his potential? And for a hot minute, for like 3 years, I was an executive at eBay, and I was back home, and it had a lot of cachet to say, hey, I'm an executive at eBay. And when I told somebody that, and they're like, yep, that sounds about right. That sounds about right. And I hated that job. I hated it so much. I did it for 3.5 years because it paid me so much money, but I hated it. I just hated working there.
Couple of things. When that person said that to you, yeah, that sounds about right. I don't know about you, but that would bother me if someone said that to me. Did it bother you?
No, because I was proud of what it was. It
Okay.
wasn't dismissive. It was like, this is the kind of thing we expected you to be doing.
Yeah, but doesn't that kind of bother you? Like this idea of like, well, this is the limit of your of what you can achieve. This is how we see you.
Well, it's not a
You know?
limit. I mean, I didn't see it as a limit. I saw it as it was an achievement. It was not
Yeah, no, no.
that.
I'm not trying to deter from that. I just mean more like sometimes I think when people say things like, yeah, that's what I would expect of you, like that's how I see you, and I don't know, that always kind of irked me in the past because I'm like, well,
Well,
like
she was hot, so I was just happy she thought I was going to be doing anything. So,
fair enough.
and I mean, as you've done comedy,
No,
all
I've not.
comics.
I've not done comedy. You've
I
done
thought you
comedy.
had
You're
done comedy.
no, I'm not funny.
Okay,
But you're funny.
so
You're a comedian.
you go to if you go to a comedy, and this might not be true in the UK, but it's definitely true in the US. Everybody that's on stage at a comedy club has problems. Um, there's something not right about everybody that does comedy. There's something in their past, in their childhood, in their upbringing that screwed them up. That's what made them be a stand-up comic. I 100% believe that, and I've not met anybody that has proven otherwise to me.
What do
And
you
when
think?
you talk to comics, I find it to be 100% true.
Do you think it's like a form of a coping mechanism, like therapy almost?
Yeah, it's weird, but almost all stand-ups are introverts,
Huh.
and you'd think it would be exactly the opposite, but almost all of them are introverts. They're much happier being by themselves, and there's no lonelier place. There's no place where you are more alone than on a stage. And that might not make sense, but it's
No,
100% true.
no, I understand. As an actor, I've often heard people say this who are the very top of the industry, like, oh, it's lonely at the top, and like it's lonely being an actor, right? And I see it. I don't know if that's just like this is something I'm destined to do, acting, but I can tell you now, my life is very lonely, and I've tried various different things to change that, but I think that fundamentally you do have to kind of at some point or another accept like the type of person you are and the way you are and the way you work and the way you reverberate. Like I do have friends, I do have like people I can hang out with and every now and again, but there's a lot of being alone. And it used to really, really get to me like on a really bad level. I used to think like, oh, there's something wrong with me, right? But now I think it's more like, no, it's just there's different types of people. That's how it is. And unfortunately, with things like this, being a creative, I think a lot of the time that does come from a place of like um maybe there's trauma there, maybe there's bad things that have happened, and like I mean I've always used things like music and acting as a form of like I don't want to say like therapy because I think that's wrong, but like I've used it as like a healing process. Like when I've
Well,
gone through a bad time, like writing a song really helps, or
oh yeah,
like
absolutely. And
channeling something into a performance or whatever.
but so and I don't write songs except parody songs, but
Cool.
I've written books,
Right.
and I would say therapy is actually a fair word for that,
Mm.
honestly. Depending on is this something you're trying to work through? But imagine this, and this is a bad scenario that would be fantastic to happen. You go through let's call it the Taylor Swift. You
Mm.
have a significant other, and then you go through this traumatic breakup, and you are devastated. This girl, this guy, whatever it was, everything to you, and you lost them for whatever reason, whether it was your fault, whether it was their fault, whether it was nobody's fault, it just didn't work, no matter what. But you write a song, and this song becomes a huge hit. This song becomes, it goes viral. You get to record an album. You get to tour. First, you're opening for somebody. Then you're actually you start headlining. But this first song, this first thing that you write, this emotional piece of your history that dealt with this trauma becomes your signature hit. You now are going out there and you are performing this thing that is about your pain 200 nights a year.
Yeah.
And you can't get past that because you are constantly reiterating, this pain that you went through. I mean, how great and how terrible would that be at the same time?
I think it's like, I get what you're saying. I mean, like when I'm doing acting, for example, and I need to channel like sadness into a performance, like my character is angry or frustrated or upset, like I use the Stanislavski method, and I just go into it and draw from my own pain. Mm-hmm. And it's uncomfortable. It is, because I'm essentially it's real. It's, I don't know if I want to necessarily call it method acting, but it's real. Like I really am upset in that moment or angry, and we keep pushing and pushing, and I try to use the elements around me to my advantage. So if the director is pissing me off, great, keep pushing. It's going to get more of a reaction. When I did a short film recently, there's this character. It's just like a silly thing where the character's like late for a job interview. It's supposed to be like comedy slapstick, right? And the idea is like he gets to a point where like a bunch of birds just shit all over him, and he's just like, no, and it's
oh, you're talking about actually like flying birds?
Yeah, right.
I thought you were talking about like, because you're British, birds.
No, no, two girls, one cup shit. No, there's actual flying birds. No, and there's this bit where he sort of completely is just like devastated, right? And the directors didn't tell me to do this. I just knew this is what we needed to do. And he's dressed in a suit, bear in mind, and there's a gravel footpath, right? I dropped to my knees and I'm like, what? And I just like put loads of frustration into it. And because at that point I was 5 hours deep, it's cold, I'm hungry, we need coffee. We're going to get all those things, but we're kind of trying to push to get this part of it done. And they're checking up on me. Director's like, we'll get some coffee soon. I'm like, yeah, let's just keep going. And I'm not annoyed at him. I'm not upset or anything, but I am a bit like, but I want to channel that in. I want to use it. I don't want it to be wasted. And so whenever I think about this, like Taylor Swift doing a performance, right? She probably is sitting there, and some part of her is thinking, maybe she thinks about it, maybe she doesn't, right? I know sometimes when I perform, a lot of the time I feel detached, like if I'm singing songs about some breakup that happened 4 years ago or some dark time in my life. Sometimes I feel it, sometimes I don't. I mean, sometimes I sit there and I'll play like Radiohead songs, and I love Radiohead. I think they're amazing, right? Sometimes it's just a performance. Other times I'd have to try and hold back tears because I'm feeling something. I don't quite know what it is. And sometimes I worry like, I think this is ripe for a therapy session. But, whatever. It's part of the performance. And it's real. But I completely agree with you. I think it's kind of a double-edged sword, really. It's good and bad. And it'll always be that way because it's human emotion. There's happy emotions and stuff like that too.
Sure.
But if you're gonna, I mean, that's the thing as well. I think when I chose acting, I chose it because I fell in love with it, and it became something that I knew I had to do. And it felt similar to music, but it felt more of an accurate representation of everything I want to do, because it incorporates everything. I'm using all parts of myself. But when I realized like, all I have to do is just channel that pain and anger and everything into this performance. That's all I have to do. And it's like, yeah, but it's always going to take it out of you. So, like, for example, when I hear like the very best like method actors of our time, and people get a bit annoyed, they're like, "Oh, they go way too over the top with it," and I agree. I agree. Some of them do. Okay, like no one wants to get mailed, animals by Jared Leto. I understand. uh, Allegedly, I don't know.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I'm familiar with what you're talking about.
right, but at the same time, I totally understand if that actor wants to be away from it and kind of sit in that character, sit in that feeling. Like I heard this story a while back, and there's footage of this, or there's a recording of this online. It's like Christian Bale's like recording something, some movie, and he absolutely loses his fucking mind at a
It's
lighting guy.
Terminator. It's Terminator Salvation.
Is it Terminator?
Salvation.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. He loses it at this lighting guy. And I listened to this a few times, and I'm sure it'd be easy to sit there and be like, "Oh, Christian Bale's an asshole. Unprofessional. How could he do that?" And it's like, think about this for a second. You're in the middle of this scene. It's an intense part of the scene. It's really intense. You're drawing on like really intense emotions, and it's a serious production. Everyone there is doing a job, right? And you got some guy fucking with the lighting at the side, and it's distracting, and it's sucking you out of it. Now you can argue this both ways. Should he have spoken to that guy like that? Of course not. However, is the guy going to take him seriously if he just goes up to him and goes, "Oh, sorry, yeah, it's just we're doing this scene. Could you, just stop doing that?" Da, 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 right? And you could argue maybe that would work, and that would be the better way to do it, right? But at the same time, it's an emotional. Acting is an emotional thing. It's an emotional concept. When at its best, like when you're actually doing it properly, you're tapping into things that, and we spoke earlier about this idea of uncontrollable elements. It gets like that sometimes, and that's why you see like actors on set breaking down a little bit, because you're tapping into something that's like, shit, man, this could go anywhere. And so when you got these people like causing a distraction to the side and not being professional, it causes a bit of a problem. But again, I do understand the idea of being professional, and there are these amazing actors, and I've said this before on the show, but people like Gary Oldman who can just click it on and off in the middle. I think it's amazing. I'd love to be like that. That's the that's the height of it. The very best method actors can do that. But I think for many method actors, you got to sit in that feeling and kind of turn off the outside world and live in that moment. And that's not always going to be great for everyone else that has to be around you, unfortunately.
I can't remember who it was. It's an older British actor. I think he was talking to Dustin Hoffman. Mm-hmm. And I think I want to say it was on the set of The Graduate, or maybe it was on the set of Running Man. But in Hoffman, I believe, was like a method actor. Mm-hmm. And he was talking to this other actor about the process he was going through to get into this character, to get into this other character's, or the character's head. And the guy I'm talking about said, "My dear boy, have you ever tried just acting?" Which I understand there's various different methods. And you brought up Christian Bale. Christian Bale is an incredible actor. Mm-hmm. And you have to wonder sometimes if the amount of talent somebody has and the amount of attitude, if those things are tied, or is that a learned behavior? Is it because he's Christian Bale that he acts that way? Or is he Christian Bale because he is that way? Is it chicken egg scenario? Is he that way because he can be, because he's Christian Bale? Or is he Christian Bale because he is that way?
I know exactly what you're saying, but a bit of comparison for a second will give you a good example of, well, I'll give you the answer to this question. Okay. Tom Cruise. Mm-hmm. You look at interviews with Tom Cruise and you look at interviews with Christian Bale. Now, what do we know about interviews? We know that actors have to do like maybe several hundred in a day for promotion of a movie.
Yeah, they're doing press junket.
Yeah, so they hear like a million of these questions and it gets jarring and tiring. And anyone in there anyone would feel the same way. But when you see both of them doing it, Tom Cruise is putting on a performance, and there's various reasons for that. But one thing I've noticed is that he's playing a character. He's playing Tom Cruise. He's playing this person. And now you can argue, oh, that's wacky Hollywood, that's that Scientology shit, that's X, Y, and Z, and you probably be right, right? But then you see these actors, Joaquin Phoenix, Christian Bale, Al Pacino, who are students of the craft. When they started out, and they all had different kind of ins. For example, Al Pacino is very dear to my heart. He's one of my very favorite actors because he was penniless and broke when he first got into, say like The Godfather. No one wanted him there, and he knew that, and he just went in there and kept doing it, and has become one of the greatest actors of a generation. It comes across in interviews that they still recognize they are just people, you know. And listen, I think you make a very good point about this idea of like how much can you detach from like, oh, this person, this name, I am this person, my name carries weight, etc. But then I go back to our previous conversation about how, yeah, your name might mean something today, but it's not always going to mean something, and you might not always have this mesmerizing career that you have. Not everyone is lucky enough to have a steady career like that. For example, if you look at someone like Brendan Fraser, who has recently,
perfect example, yeah,
he's recently had, they're calling it a renaissance. I love that, career renaissance. And I look at that and I'm like, okay, here's a guy who was blacklisted and was not able to get, he was doing stuff, but he just wasn't really featured a lot. And there were a lot of personal things going on in his life, reasons for that, but he basically just wasn't picked up for any major projects for a long time. Then finally, he's able to kind of get on his feet, get in a position where he can deliver performances again, and everyone wants him. And why? Because, and this is often something that's forgotten in the acting industry, I feel, is the importance of the cast and crew and the people you work with, and like just treating people with respect. For example, I'll go back to the previous story about Christian Bale. I understand that he was very apologetic to that lighting guy and like made amends with that guy. And, he fucked up. He knew he fucked up. And maybe he was right in that moment to like have a bit of a, this is important. But then he made amends because he's a good guy. You can tell he's a good guy. He's a good person. And I think that's always going to go a lot further than throwing your name and weight around like it means something. And, we're all just people at the end of the day. And I feel like largely we should always be measured by how we treat others, the respect we show, the love we show, etc. When it comes to like a professional context, that's always going to go a lot further too, because people are going to remember like, well, this is what it's like to work with this guy. When people think of Brendan Fraser, they think like, oh, he was our childhood. Oh, he was such a fun loving guy. Oh, like, he was this, that, and the other. And he's still that guy. He's just older. Right. And he's welcomed back with open arms. But people don't forget. They never forget how you treated them.
Well, there's I can't remember. I think it was John Kerry. You know who John Kerry is?
I know Jim. I don't know
John. John Kerry was he ran for president against George W. Bush.
Interesting. When? 2000?
This would have been back in 2004.
Oh, mad. Okay. Interesting.
But what somebody said something about John Kerry, which I thought was very, very true. And it said, when you see how somebody treats their staff or people that work for them, that says more about that person than any other indicator you can get.
Yep.
And there was an incident where he was skiing and it was like a photo op, and one of his people did something, and he was caught on film or tape or whatever, berating one of the people that worked for him. And having worked in entertainment in a couple different capacities, when I was in television, and then also, I was in a movie, and I talked about this on our last podcast.
All right.
And when you see the people at the top, whether they be the director or it be the talent or whomever, and then you see the way that they treat other people, from, little peons like me that was an extra, or little peons like me that was a producer or production assistant, whatever the role happened to be. So much you can say about the personality of the people based on how they treat people up and down the line. Doesn't matter if it's a C-level executive or it is like the person who's mopping the floors at an organization. And one of the things I've tried to tell people that I work with, that I work for, that work for me, is my expectations for people is very, very, it's very, very little. It's very, very minimal. The minimum expectation I have is that everybody has to show everybody respect.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be nice. You don't have to be friends with people. You don't even have to be cordial, but you have to be professional. And it's great if you're friends. It's great if you're cordial. It's great if you're nice. But I can't expect that. But it's when people cross that line into things that are unprofessional, or you're belittling somebody not because of something they do, but because of their station, not necessarily their station in life, but their station at whatever job it happens to be. And then also how people are when they are famous versus when they're not famous.
Mm-hmm.
There was a guy from my high school that I knew. I didn't know him well, but he went on to play professional baseball. So I suppose cricket for you, but he played in the major leagues for, I think, like 10 years. So that's a decent career, made a lot of money. And the last time I personally ever saw him was I was actually back at home, and I was playing in an alumni basketball tournament, and I was on a team with him. And between games, a bunch of us that were on the team, we went down to this local bar and we were just having drinks. And he had not yet made the major leagues. He was in the minor leagues. And I said, "Hey, so you think you're ever going to get called up to the show?" And he said, "If it was going to happen, it would have happened by now. It's never going to happen."
Yeah.
And then 3 months later, he got called up.
Yeah.
And from what I understand from friends of his that I'm friends with, as soon as he got called up to the show, he cut off all ties with everybody.
Wow.
And I don't know if that's a defense mechanism, or, I don't want people, trying to use me or get something from me.
Mm.
But I like to think, when my podcast empire grows and I become this huge guy, that I will still look at my lessers and still treat them with respect like I should. It's supposed to be funny, my lessers. But no, I think that I like to think that nothing would change about me as far as like the people I've known for long periods of time, that I would be the same with them as I've always been.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that fame and money and things like that can change people. And I think honestly, it's probably hard for it not to. And there's also, you see people like Hammer. Hammer was somebody who got, MC Hammer, can't touch this. Mm-hmm. Too legit to quit. He had this huge entourage, and he pissed through tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars and ended up broke because he took care of everybody. And I think there's a difference. You don't have to take care of your friends, but if they're your friends and they were your friends when you were nobody, they should still be your friends when you're somebody.
Yeah.
And I think finding that middle ground of still being just Christian and not being, the Christian, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, I thought about this a lot, like, because people have asked before, like, the thing that people often say is like, "Oh, don't forget us when you get to the top." And I'm like, "Yeah, all right, if that ever happens." But let's just say it did, just for argument's sake. I'm still going to be that kid who grew up in like northwest London in the suburbs, like who, like the boiler would break down every month or every Christmas or whatever the fuck, or every winter, sorry. And, like that's what I grew up with, and I loved it. And, I'm very proud of that upbringing. And I can't imagine changing just because of what? Because of having more money, because of having like career, like, for example, like acting, I couldn't care less about being famous or, any of that shit. Who cares? It doesn't really mean anything anymore. Like I've said this before in the past, that like once upon a time, hundreds of years ago, you were famous, but if you had invented something that changed mankind, and it was more like fame was more like admiration and respect. Like, wow, this person has changed humanity as we know it, or they've given something so amazing to us, right? And then over time, you know, the entertainment industry boomed, and then suddenly it became more about like just glorifying a particular lifestyle, or you know, and I don't think that that's all bad necessarily, but there are a lot of negative elements to it. But the problem is, somewhere down the line, it became about like, oh, if you're a celebrity or famous, you're somehow better than the average person. And, you know, the press are guilty of making this distinction. You hear it sometimes. They're like, oh, what do you think of like normal people, everyday people? And it's like, they were just people, you know? Like, and I always pay very close attention to people who become famous and then years later, they're not famous anymore, and like how they act and how people treat them, etc. Because
you have Big Brother there, right? I mean, I think Big Brother actually came from the UK, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. Sorry about that.
That's right. I was almost.
Oh yeah. I'll take ownership for that. Yeah, great. Yeah.
No, I was almost on Big Brother a couple times. So
wow, really?
The US version, obviously.
Why?
I just think it would be fun.
Yeah.
And I think that the concept of it, and it's different in the US. The show is different because it doesn't have like the public voting people off and stuff.
Okay.
It's done differently here. But when I was in the interview process, and I made it out of like the first couple rounds, and I was actually talking to them in person, and I was in this hotel room, and they interviewed me it was about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And just, you know, peppering me with questions and stuff.
The Spanish Inquisition, fucking hell.
And I think the reason more than anything else that I did not get on the show is I disrespected them. And I didn't mean to, but when you go into an interview like that for a show like Big Brother or Survivor or something, it's the opposite of what you're doing when you're in an interview for a job. Because when you are interviewing for a job, you want them to like you. You want them to want to hire you because of your skills. Mm-hmm. When you're interviewing for Big Brother, for example, you want them to think you're interesting. You want them to remember you. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad. You want them to remember you. But number one, they said I had the worst answer they've ever had to any question they've ever asked. And I'll tell you what that one was. At the time, I was 44, 45. And, you know, I was married. I had kids. And they said, well, what are you going to do on this show when these attractive young women are interested in you? And I said, well, look at me. I'm not really that concerned about it. I think I can handle that. And they said, would you ever cheat on your wife? And I said, no, I wouldn't. That really seems like a lot of work. And they said, what? And they said, yeah, if you're in a relationship, that's a lot of work. If you're in 2 relationships, that's double the work. And you got to hide this one from this one. And you got to keep this one super happy because otherwise she'll tell this one. That seems like a lot. No, it's just not. They're like, that is the worst thing we've ever heard to that question. But the last question that they gave me, and I think the reason I didn't get on the show is they said, what are you going to do when Big Brother makes you famous? And I said, slow down. This is Big Brother 16. You're not Survivor. Nobody watches this show.
You said that?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I'm sure they remembered it. So, I mean, on the one hand, I served the purpose I was trying to do with that answer, but I'm not wrong. I mean, it's a show that gets 1.5 million viewers.
What did they look like when you said that? What was their facial expressions looking like?
It was a slack-jawed. Like, I cannot believe they just said that. Because
afterwards, were they like, yeah. So we'll get back to you in like 2 weeks.
They just kind of like, there's 2 of them. One of them looked and they looked at each other, and
like it's a movie, yeah.
Yeah, that's
this guy.
Yeah, he disrespected our franchise, and because there is tiers for reality television, it's like Survivor is a much bigger show, than Big Brother is here. So it was, and they ask, okay, if you had a choice of going on this show or this show or this show, which one would you go on? Well, not yours, because this is like my last choice. I'd go on it because I think it would be fun. But if I had a choice between this and doing this other one, I'd do this other one. So
And it's funny as well. Like I've had people in the past say like, "Oh, why don't you?" Because I've had opportunities to go on television, reality TV, but I don't rate it. I don't think it's like worth it. And of course, people have disagreed with me. They're like, "Oh, yeah, but you could use that. You could use that fame and like try and leverage it, I suppose." And to a degree, they're right. But here's the thing: that's your first real introduction to the world. Yeah,
sure.
what you've done before, like no one really cares. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like,
unless you said the wrong thing on Twitter 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. But like, fundamentally, like that's really your introduction. Like, for example, when an actor like makes it after many years of like relative obscurity, they always say like overnight success, and they don't talk about the fact that the guy or girl or whatever has been, trying to push it for like 15 years. Like, I'm sure if I made it in the next year or so, they wouldn't ignore the fact that I've been acting since 2019. It'd be like, oh, wow, this nobody has now made it out of nowhere. And it's like, yeah, okay, but that's not really how it is it? And I feel with reality TV, they're trying to tell stories that aren't true. Like, if you'd have gone on that show, it wouldn't have been, oh, here's Matthew, he does this, and this. It'd be like they'd make a story for you, like a narrative that you've got to play up to. And it's like, oh, will creepy Matthew be checking out these young women? Like, let's see, let's put some, I don't know, traps in place to see if he falls for them, the honey traps, I don't know, whatever. Like that's the sort of shit they would do because they're awful, the reality TV industry. They're absolutely awful. But it's a business, it's entertainment. They've got their objectives, you have yours. And when I look at it like that, it's a no-brainer for myself to not go on a show like that, because it's like, that's not going to help me achieve my goals. Like, everything I do is based on reputation and building a brand. If I suddenly then go on a show like that, I might as well just shoot myself in the foot and just forget about the last however many years of work of trying to say like, oh, this is what I do and this is what I do. Because people would just be like, yeah, that's great that you're trying to do this thing now, but like, what about that stupid shit you did in Big Brother? Like, that's what people are going to think about.
Have you ever been recognized?
No. Of course not.
It's weird. It's weird when.
Have you been recognized?
Yeah.
What for?
I mean, not often and not in a while, but sometimes I've had people come up to me like at the grocery store and say, did I see you at the Funny Bone or something like that?
Oh, for comedy, right?
Yeah. And
cool.
It happened a couple times in comedy clubs, like when I was not performing, when I just happened to be there.
I was gonna say it'd be awkward if you were on stage. You're like, wait, don't I know you?
Yeah. Did I see you? Yeah, I was on stage 20 minutes ago. Not that memorable.
I was thinking more like when you were actually on stage performing your set, and someone's like, "Wait, don't I know you?" You're like, "Shut up."
Yeah, that'd be scary. But let's say I'm not a good example. Let's say one of your good mates, one of your good blokes, is a producer or gets a job as a producer, and they can't find somebody for not a starring role, but a pivotal role, a key role, a co-starring role for I want to say EastEnders. I don't know. I'm just trying to throw out any kind of like British shit I know, but something that has a role that would be recurring, and it's a shortcut because it's not something that you went in and did. Yeah. It was, hey, I know this guy, he'd be perfect for it. You take that, right? Yeah,
as long as they kill off my character.
Oh, is that because it's EastEnders?
Yeah, I'd do it. Yeah, no, well, that's different though. Soap opera is different because it's still an opportunity to act, you know. And the thing about soap operas is that some of them, like if we're talking like those old classic like Spanish ones that are over the top and silly and
telenovelas,
yeah, like, but they're supposed to be, that's what they are, and they still have a core audience of people that love that, and they cater to that audience. Soap operas, I'm not against them. I recently sent a self-tape in to be on Coronation Street.
I've heard of it. I've never seen it.
I get offered it a lot. It's basically set in the North. And yeah, absolutely. And I've watched all of the soap operas here in the UK at some point or another in my life, and they've all offered something good at some point or another. They're also epically tragically bad as well. I've seen some absolutely abysmal acting where I'm like, wow, I can't believe this made it onto television. Like, Jesus.
Even today, you
Yeah,
still see that today.
yeah. But that's the thing. It's back and forth. It's you can argue it's directors, you can argue it's bad acting. There's a lot of arguments you can make. An opportunity like that, I would for sure not turn down because it's acting, you know, and I would make the best of it, and I would see what I could do with it. Because I love acting. Reality television and like doing all these like silly shows, that's not going to help me with my acting career. That's just going to make a tit of myself. I'm going to make a tit of myself. It'd be like, oh, what idiot, you know, and that's it. That's
I was just, the reason I was asking is because it's kind of like it's a shortcut in a way.
Yes. You're right. You it will set you up. You'll get a little bit of like 5 minutes of fame that maybe you can use to leverage to other things. However, crucial point, the way people perceive you is going to be different. Completely, that's it. You know, unless you can do something that completely breaks out to the extent where you surpass it. Like, for example, Harry Styles is this huge, massive musician, right? Next to no one really remembers the fact that he was on X Factor. Yeah, a lot of UK people will remember that, but a lot of people won't. They'll just be like, "Oh, there's Harry Styles, the singer."
But
you know,
is a talent? I know it kind of is reality, but is that really the same thing? Like,
yeah, I'd say so. I mean, because
isn't Britain's Got Talent, X Factor?
Yeah, well,
you probably have
okay,
like
they're talent shows. You know, like you got American Idol. Like I get what you're saying, but yeah, don't, dude. Those are television shows, and come on, you've worked in television. You know how it is.
Oh no, I know somebody who's a professional musician who was on a backing band that was on America's Got Talent.
Okay,
and he said it was one of the most soul crushing things he's ever been involved in. And this is a guy who has toured with Lenny Kravitz. And so, I mean, he's not, somebody that is desperate for opportunity. I mean, as a musician, unless you're like in a key band, but he just said it was so soul crushing.
What did he find soul crushing about it? Because it's interesting that a guy who's essentially like a, part of regular band, session player, I would imagine as well, is taking part in that. I guess it was a good gig, like money wise. He did it. Maybe it's a favor to someone else.
I think that's what it was. I think it was kind of, they got into a spot and they needed somebody to fill a spot on a band, a backing band. But it's just a thing where, and I agree. It is a television show and it is edited and it doesn't happen exactly how it is portrayed to happen. But when I look at a show, whether it be a singing show like an Idol show or a talent show like America's Got Talent, there's things in those shows where even though I might not appreciate the type of music it is, I can appreciate the talent behind it. And I look at it as Clay Aiken is a perfect example. You probably have no idea who Clay Aiken is.
I can't say that I do, no.
He came in second place on American Idol like 15 years ago or something.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
And he, not my type of music at all, but amazing voice, somebody super, super talented. And I can do that with any kind of music. I can listen to music and I can say, I respect the ability, the craft to be able to do this. And I can say, but it's not for me. It's not my cup of tea. And I'm not a huge country music guy. There's some country I like, but I saw Garth Brooks in concert like probably 10 years ago. Amazing show. Probably the best show I've ever seen. And you can tell that he loves what he's doing. But when I look at somebody on like one of these shows and I see them singing, I know that this is something I cannot do. And there are things where I can't play an instrument. I can't carry a tune. There are certain things that are just not in my wheelhouse to do. And I respect people that have the ability to do these things, even if I don't necessarily like what it is they do with them.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I mean, I think it was just being able to respect like the different abilities and skills and talents that people have, isn't it? You're always going to kind of, I think, especially if you work in those industries, you're going to be able to respect that. But yeah, when I look at shows like that, I agree. It is soul destroying because it has nothing to do with music or performance or talent. Really, it's a television show. It's about making money from people and exploiting people. However you want to look at it, you know.
Yeah, but every TV show is about making money.
Yes, but some shows are more inclined to either to help people or to put on like a good performance and everyone's kind of walks away from it like better off versus, you know, oh, we're going to exploit people for, you know, financial gain or for, I don't know, for hilarity purposes. And here's the problem with that is it sometimes it can ruin people's lives. It can lead to like really serious situations down the road. And I always looked at like talent shows like X Factor and Britain's Got Talent and stuff as like modern day circus. And but not in any positive way. It's
the people are the elephants.
Yeah, and it is cruel. I honestly think it's cruel. And I was quite happy when it ended in the UK. I was like, yeah, finally, you know, maybe it won't have such a strong kind of grab hold on the music industry, which is another element to it as well, is like the hold it has and how it's all just corporately manufactured. And there's just no like none of the art and the soul of music and what music is at its very best. And don't get me wrong, the music industry at large has a lot of that too. I mean, you know, but at the same time, like there are a lot of amazing musicians out there that are just doing their thing. As you said, like there's country musicians, there's people like there's so many indie musicians coming through right now that are doing their own thing and they're nailing it and they're owning it, doing it their way. And it's beautiful to see. And I think with creative endeavors at large, when you're doing it your way in the way that works for you, it's liberating. It truly is. And it will never not be. But you know what?
I'm going to feel bad now about, you know, watching any kind of reality TV. That's what you can put on. What did I accomplish today? I made Matt feel really, really shitty about the fact that he watches reality television.
No, listen, that I'm not saying all reality TV is bad, right? I'm saying that when it's used to exploit people, it is, you know, because there are plenty of examples. Okay, you take Big Brother as an example, right? Those people willingly go in there. Now,
sure.
People, not everyone, people that go in there will be very smart. Other people will be not very smart. And so the smart ones will, you know, maybe be acting or working around, you know, what's being told to them. They know what's going on. They know what's up. Other people will go on that show and not know and will be manipulated and exploited. And, you know, it might be embarrassing for them. It might be quite difficult or frustrating or whatever. But at least they can kind of walk away from it, like knowing that, you know, their life is not necessarily ruined forever. You know, when you've got like one of these snippet clips from like one of these talent shows where you've got someone like Simon Cowell going like, "Oh, you're useless, you're terrible. Like I wouldn't, you know, pick you if you're the last person on a boat in the world and the world was flooded with piss. Like I still wouldn't choose you." And it's like, come on, like, do you know what I'm saying? Like you'll always be remembered for that, you know? And I think about those people. I'm like, that's a human being. That's a real person with thoughts and feelings and dreams. And you've just turned around and said, you're hopeless. You know,
one person on that I know of, and it probably has happened more than once worldwide, but there was a reality show. This was probably back in 2002, 2003. They got voted off and they basically immediately killed themselves.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
And
well, this is the side I was trying to imply without saying it, but yeah, this is, for example,
and there's definitely like some mental stuff. And I think a lot of it is not just the production part of it, but it is the public at large as well, because, you know, the internet, and I love the internet. This would not be possible without the internet.
Exactly.
You know, it can be a force for incredible good.
Mm-hmm.
It also is a great porn delivery mechanism. There's a lot of great things about the internet, but it is also so incredibly toxic because of the anonymity of it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if you ever frequent any kind of message boards about anything, there is a hate group for every person that's ever existed that's been on a TV show somewhere in the internet. And reality shows, especially, people feel a certain amount of ownership of these people because they happen to be on a show that they watch.
Mm-hmm.
And just having read some of the things that people have said about people that have been on these shows, it is amazing. And that has always been a thing that's kind of in the back of my head is, if I did this, I am signing up to have people say nasty things about me, to get beat up online. And the worst thing you can probably do is read your own press, because it's not press. It's not something that's positive. It's going to be a lot of stuff that's tearing you down.
The reality is, as well, is like how seriously you take this shit. If you just realize it's people that you don't care about's opinions, it doesn't matter. I think I've always looked at it like, if the majority of people hate you and hate what you're doing and can't stand the sight of you, maybe you're doing something wrong. Maybe you need to change something. If most people, you know, think you're all right, think you're decent, then you probably are. I think it's always worth taking on board like constructive criticism and such. But in those scenarios, this is the next point I want to make, is this: I think there's this problem of entitlement. It's like, oh, like you said, I own you. I deserve X, Y, and X explanation for this, that, and the other. Like, I had it today. I did a live stream on TikTok, and I've not done it in a long, long time. I broke the cardinal rule of saying never say never, you know, I said never, and then I'm back on the app trying to promote myself. But I was on there, and I was just saying like, oh, I'm going to trial this new thing. I'm going to like be there on Thursdays, try and use it as a promotional tool, but I'm still going to stick to my Twitch and my community and all that stuff, right? Anyway, I'm there, and some of my core communities there, they've joined me, and they're like, oh, this is interesting, isn't it? And we're having fun with it. But then I was reminded of like some of the reason why I didn't really always enjoy being on TikTok, because there was this like entitlement. I'll give you an example. So every now and again, I'll get a question like, oh, you're an actor. Okay, so anything you've been in that I would know? And that's a very common question. If you're an actor,
honestly, I would have asked that too.
Yeah.
So I mean,
and I expect it, and it's fine. Sometimes I just answer straight. Sometimes I have a bit of fun with it, whatever. And I've got quite a lot of acting credits. So, and I don't, the stream wasn't like, if it was a stream about like, oh, I'm just going to sit here and talk about my acting career, then fine, I'll go through every single thing I've done. But it's like these live streams are very quick, and I'm trying to cover a lot of different things. So maybe I don't want to go through all of it. And so I just said like, oh, hey, well, listen, if you want to see what I've done, go on my website. Here's a link, christianreeve.com/acting. And you can find all my credits there. Have a little look, see what you think. And this person immediately was just like, oh, well, if you want me to be a fan of yours, like you should tell me, like, what have you been in? And one of my mods was just like, oh, well, he's been in feature films and stuff. And she's like, which feature films? Right. And I just said politely, I was like, listen, you show me respect and you're polite, and I'll go all out. I'll roll out a red carpet for you. I'm more than happy to do that, right? If you don't show me that level of respect and politeness, I'm not going to give you anything, And they're like, oh, well, I won't be your fan if you don't. I'm like, I don't care. like it doesn't, like, I'm sorry, but like this whole idea that you owe people something is just bullshit. Like, I don't know where that, I think that's just a generational thing, maybe. I don't know.
No, I don't think so, because you see it with people my age or older as well, especially when it comes to legacy properties.
Okay.
Current example is Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
The new Indiana Jones. You owe me a better movie than you gave me. Same thing with Star Wars. There's this feeling that, these are characters that movies, toys that people grew up with, and they feel that, they are owed something in that meshes with how they thought it was supposed to go.
I've got very mixed feelings about this, because I do understand it is upsetting when someone a new production takes over an existing property and completely changes what it was originally about. And like, it sucks to see that. I understand that. And if you're a hardcore fan of something, I understand how upsetting that would be. However, you hit the nail on the head there. Like, if you grew up with Star Wars in the 70s and 80s, right? And then you expected, like, say, the prequels to be exactly the same as those, then you're kidding yourself, because it's a different era. It's a different time. It's a different production entirely. Of course it's going to be different. And of course, when the most newest films came out, everyone lost their fucking marbles over that. And it's like, it's never going to be exactly what you want, because you can't please everyone. B, making movies, making productions, any kind of creative thing, it's never going to be, if it's being done properly, it's never going to be about catering to what the fans want. Like, you see this sometimes in the book industry, like, oh, I wish like the books they wrote were like earlier in their career. And it's like, but you got to change with the times. That was a moment in time. We did that thing. You move on. You don't want to rehash, like, living in your glory years, keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, because you'll get people will resent you for that.
Yeah. Why can't they change?
Yeah, I think it's just, at the end of the day, some people just have a hard time accepting that, like, everything has a beginning and an end, and that change is inevitable, and you have to accept it. Appreciate that it happened, but don't sit and obsess and live in this, like, oh, it has to be the way it was, or, we've got to boycott this shit. We got to, because not everything comes down to that. Not everything is, sometimes a movie's just a movie. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there are massive examples of where that's not the case. And I will agree, like, sometimes people are right on the money when it comes to things are not written well and they don't take into account anything. For example, I think Game of Thrones is the best example. I've spoken about it many times on the show before. The problem with that was that it was lazy writing at the very end.
Well, they ran out of source material. So,
but here's the thing. They had the original author of the books on hand. Mm-hmm. They were offered 2 more seasons with HBO, more than happy. They probably would have given them more. And, that would have been more than enough time to work something out, extend it over. The actors, here's the thing. The actors wanted it to be 10 seasons as well. But the directors were like, nah, fuck you guys. We want this Star Wars trilogy that we're doing, which would have been Solo. And
is not going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, they got Solo, but it was a flop. And then they just didn't get it. And they decided to be lazy and just take the money and just make something which, and look, I understand they did something, and you can make an argument, well, this was their creative vision, fair enough. But, like, a lot of the decisions they made were not based in, like, logical storytelling. It was just like, let's just do this for shock value. Let's just do this. Fuck this. It's like in the wrestling industry when you do, like, hot shot booking, and you just, one week you just book an angle which is a bit crazy and makes no sense, and you get a few ratings, and it's like, yeah, great, but what about next week? And it's like, oh, well, we didn't think of that. And it's like, oh, well, that's the end of our fucking show then, isn't it? It's like, yeah, you have to think ahead. If it's a story, it has to be 3 parts. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the end needs to be something that, if it's a good story, you can look back throughout the course of the story and be like, oh, there was foreshadowing. There was hints of this.
It makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is why they often say that if you're going to write a story, you should start from the end and work your way backwards. With Game of Thrones, they didn't do that. They built up like 5 to 6 really, really solid seasons, built up a lot of characters, and then just in the last couple of seasons was just like, fuck that, and just, and then it just very easily became about like, oh, this is just clearly a cash grab. This is about money. This is not about putting something creative out there that people can enjoy. And that is an instance where I would agree with the fans, like, yeah, this is just unacceptable.
That's how I felt about Lost.
Interesting one. Yeah.
Because Lost, I got into Lost like when it was in its 3rd season.
Yeah, I think many of us like kind of got suckered in that period. It was exciting.
And binged through the first 2.5 seasons, got into that 3rd season, then got into the week to week, and then I remember when I got to the point where I was watching it on a week to week basis, and I remember where the show jumped the shark for me, where I actually turned to my wife and said, what the fuck is that? And that was the frozen donkey wheel, when they turned the frozen donkey wheel, when I think it was Ben and somebody else fell down the hole into the frozen donkey wheel, and then they turned it and it unstuck the island and it started bopping around in time and all this other stuff. And it was just, and then when they go to the conclusion of it, in the conclusion, okay, this is what this meant. Then they're trying to, solve or explain what some of these mysteries are. And the explanations they give don't match with the stuff that you saw in the first several seasons of the show. And that was a show that really kind of hit the burgeoning of the internet, with the internet kind of coming up and message boards and people having all these fan theories. And it was the first show probably that was really enhanced by the internet as far as the fan base. And I think those are the people that they let down. But it's now I'm the entitled one. I thought I was entitled to the show ending well.
See, again, I would argue the same thing. It's illogical. Let's look at this for a second. Lost was a survival show. You weren't really told much. You were just told, okay, these people, they were on a flight. It crashes. They've all got different stories. We're going to do this unique type of storytelling where each episode focuses on a specific character or a series of characters. Great, device. You can do a lot with that. Lots of flashbacks, so you can kind of mix and match and tell different types of stories, give background to things. Great. And those first 2 to 3 seasons, I'm right there with you, buddy. I loved it. I thought it was, where are they going to go next with this? Oh, who's this mysterious guy? What's going to happen with this? What's the Dharma Initiative? All this really fascinating stuff. And then, I'll be honest, I dropped off after that stuff, but I read up on it later. And I just thought, this is so lazy, and just why they couldn't have gone with the whole survival thing. Because as I understand, it was they were basically, they all dead. It was limbo or purgatory or some shit. And that kind of essentially it makes it
it's
sort of,
it's sort of, they at one point they were dead, and that's when they were in purgatory, and they went from flashbacks to flash forwards, and then they had jumping around in time, where half of the group was in the 1980s and then the other group was in the current time. And
see, that right there as well is problematic. Not so much because of the fact that that as a concept is unacceptable. It's more the fact that okay, well, this was originally a survival show. Now it's a show about time travel and existentialism and stuff. And it's well, that would be fine if it was Doctor Who, where you kind of expect that. Yeah. But this is not
time travel in that show.
Yeah, but you don't expect it in this. And it's not to say that, you can't have the unexpected, but it's well, which is it? What is this show? If you establish the show as, this is a show about time travel, or this is a show about purgatory or whatever, you can work with that. But when you just change, to me, it seems as though Lost was kind of not planned from the get-go. They had an initial idea, but they never had the end goal in mind.
And I think it was just if a show like that kind of necessitates knowing where you're going, and you have A, you have Z or Z for you, and then everything in between you can fill in, as long as it makes sense with all the stuff that happened before, and everything that follows after that has to make sense with that. But they kind of had the beginning, they had a somewhat idea of the end, and then they just started throwing shit at the wall. And
which is
some of it stuck and some of it didn't.
But that's the biggest problem when you start doing that, because then you lose all meaning and purpose, and it just becomes impossible to follow. And as a and here's the thing, and I've used this example before, but if you have a show let's say How I Met Your Mother, right? Mm-hmm. Hotly contested ending, a lot of people were pissed off with that. They planned it from the get-go. That was always,
they had to, because they had the end stuff done with the kids,
right? Yeah, and that was always the end goal. And a lot of people argued, it should have just ended with the mother and the son, and also the Ted and the mother. And I agree. I think that would have been more of a beautiful ending, but they chose to go with their ending, but they at least made it logical. Excuse me. So, for example, one thing that a lot of people don't like is the fact that they broke up Robin and Barney. Mm-hmm. And, that sucks. And I get that, right? But at least it made sense. at least it was like, okay, they told a story that you could buy, and you're like, okay, this is why this happened. And while Ted and Robin do not make a good couple, and I know the argument is, well, in time maybe things can work better, maybe it can work out later on, and that's, you can argue all day about that. But at least it was a tangible story that you can follow and be like, okay, you can see the signs here and there, it makes sense, fine, right? And then it becomes more about like people agreeing versus people not agreeing over, like, it's subjective, and that's okay. But at least it was planned out. Lost was just set to fail, and they had themselves to blame for it, really, to be honest. And it's such a, I feel really bad for the fan base, I really do, because I remember the hype of that. I remember how exciting that was. And then
it was magical. I mean, it was just every new thing, and it was, you wanted to see what was coming next, and you wanted to understand, what are these numbers, what is this hatch in the ground, and it was and now so many things are released in batches, where you don't have, well, you're waiting a week until the next show. And honestly, we're all kind of spoiled by that, because there are some things like on Apple TV, and then also on some other even streaming services, where they release shows weekly, as opposed to dropping the whole season.
I hate that so much.
I want to watch the next episode. And a lot of times what we will do is, okay, we know that this show is going to have 10 episodes. We'll wait for the first 6 episodes to be out before we start watching it, because then we can binge, and then we won't have much time left on the back end until the last episodes come out.
It's interesting you mentioned this as well, because I remember, like, when I would go back and watch old TV shows, I always just get irked by like the whole, oh, why do they have to do the TV recap thing, man? It's so annoying. But it's like, you need that, because you forget, a week passes, you forget the fuck what happened. Like, I'm watching 3 different, so I'm watching The Sopranos right now, but I'm also watching Secret Invasion, the Marvel property, Fear the Walking Dead, and what was the other thing? Walking Dead, Dead City, right? So I'm watching all 4 of those shows. Sopranos, great. I can just keep binging it as I please. Fantastic. The other shows have to wait weekly. And I need that recap, because I'm like, oh yeah, that happened, and that, and that. Okay, I'm up to speed. Because otherwise I'm like, I got like it's like when someone asks you to like draw, let's say like you witnessed a crime, but then it's not like a day afterwards, it's like a week afterwards. So you have to like, oh, can you draw a picture of this person? You're like, well, I think he might have had a beard, and I don't know, well, maybe was it that you got like a hazy image. You can't really paint a clear image of what.
Yeah, you can't remember what happened 3 days ago, much less a week ago, or if it was a season finale and now you're watching the first episode of the next season.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, that's like 6
I forgot
to 9
all
months.
the stuff. Yeah, I forgot all the things that happened in the last season, and all these. And even when I'm binging things, it'll be like, oh, I totally forgot that this character was even on this show, because they haven't been on it for the last episode and a half.
See, that's another interesting thing as well. I feel like sometimes they have to explain that stuff as well. Like, if it's an important character, like I've noticed this in The Sopranos here and then, there is like, you can argue like, oh, well, they're just busy doing other things, like, but sometimes like a particular person's absence is like conspicuous. It's like, is that literary, a plot device? And sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
Like there's this character that Tony has an affair with, and he's having an affair with this woman, and she's also dating one of his capos, Ralphie the character.
Okay.
And it's obviously it's a problematic situation. In the end, it kind of comes to a good like resolution, but then there afterwards, they just never mention the relationship again. Like, she just disappears from the show. And I'm thinking, like, did I miss that? And I'm like, no, I watched this show intently. Like, I would have seen that if there'd been like a major argument where she was just gone. I guess he's just not hooking up with her anymore, I guess. And because it just got to the end of the season, and now going into season 5, and I'm like, oh, okay.
Is this your first watch through of it?
Yeah. No spoilers, please.
No, I won't. And I have not watched The Sopranos, and I didn't watch the.
You have to. It's so good.
No, I watched it. I haven't watched it since it was originally on. I watched it when it was originally on.
Yeah.
I did not watch the Saints of Newark.
Many Saints of Newark. Yeah.
Yeah, I've not watched that. But have you ever watched The Wire?
I haven't, but I'm thinking I might go to that next.
Okay. The Wire, I think, is 5 seasons.
How many episodes per season?
8 ish.
That's not too bad. Maybe I will check it out then. How long are the episodes? Because Sopranos is like 55 minutes. It's like a movie every time.
They're about an hour each, just about. But The Wire is awesome. The last season is a little bit okay, but the show is awesome. You'll watch the first season. If you watch the first season, you'll be like, "Oh my god, this show is great." Mm-hmm. And then you'll start watching the second season, and you'll say, "This is not the same show at all. It is so completely different." And you have to give it like 2 episodes before you'll actually get into it, because each season is told from a slightly different perspective. And Idris Elba, this is where I discovered Idris Elba, was he plays Stringer Bell in this show. And he's amazing. He's amazing. And I think he's in the first 2 or 3 seasons. But The Wire is really, really good.
Check it out. I could talk to you all day about
and
a myriad of
we didn't
things.
talk about anything on my notes, and that's fine. But I do have something I want you to say. So
sure,
and we can just really quickly. And I
got a few questions I want to ask you as well. Okay. So, but you do your thing first.
First of all, you said that you listen to some of my podcast, and I want what your actual opinion is. So tell me what your actual opinion was from listening to the podcast.
Is it bad that I listened to it so that I could hear the bit where you're talking about me?
No, that's absolutely understandable.
No,
I mean, that's why I kind of put a time code in there.
Before that, like I liked the way it was put together. I was really impressed the fact that you've got this many episodes in. I think, as we said earlier, it says a certain thing about a person when they're able to get to that many episodes and do it for that long. I like the back and forth between you and your co-host. I think as well, knowing what I know about you, with your TV background and everything else, I was like, you can tell this is a show made by someone who's worked in production. It's smooth, it flows well. It's a show that if I had the time, I would definitely sit down and watch. And I'm not just saying that because Matthew's on my show. Go check it out, Betamax Rewind. It's a fantastic show.
You got it right this time. Yeah,
I did. Sorry, I feel awful about that. You're gonna drag me under the mud as well for that. I deserve it. I deserve it. It's fine.
All right. So now I'm going to ask you the same question again.
And
I want you to
I
want you to say blah 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 blah. And by the way, my whole thing is I think that our podcast it's a very professionally produced, unprofessional podcast, if you will. But I want you to say kind of what you said before, and then at the end of it, I want you to say the only thing that I really had a problem with is I really wish that you had a podcast partner who was as funny or as talented as you, because I think it'd make your show a lot better. And that I'm going to play on my show tonight so that he can listen to that.
That's too much for me to remember. All I can really say is that the Betamax Rewind is an excellent, fantastic show. And I was hooked. I was really into it. But then somewhere down the line, there was this other guy on the show. I don't know, some talentless hack that they brought into the show. And I just kind of thought to myself, like, who is this guy? What does he bring to the table? I'm thankful.
You talk about my co-host?
Yeah. Who's that guy?
Well,
what's his problem?
I don't know.
Who employed him? Who's in charge of employing that guy? He should be fired.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'll cut that up, and
that's mean. I feel mean. I don't like being mean. I did it one time. I went on this game show podcast one time, and I deliberately played like a character. I thought, fuck it, let's just have some fun with this. And I just felt mean the whole time. Like I was winning. It was like a point system thing. I was winning, but I was just being a dick about it. I was just like the guy basically was like, oh, you have to answer these questions and give it was like kind of like a would you rather kind of scenario, or like how much do I have to pay you before you would, like, I don't know, drink toilet water or something. And I'd just be like, I just kept going, nope, I'm worth more than that. Keep going. And he's like, oh, will you do it for 100,000? I'm like, what about 200,000? And he's like, oh, fine. And I'm like, great. And I just won because of that. But I was also kind of being honest. I was like, come on, really? Another guy's going to do this for £10? Really? That's all you give yourself? That's all you allow for yourself is £10 for eating I don't know, slice of pizza on the floor that's been mown on with like a lawnmower or something? I don't know. It's just...
That doesn't sound too bad. It's better than the toilet water. So
have you ever seen Peep Show before?
Yes.
I was rewatching it recently, and there's Jeremy and Mark find themselves like basically. So Jeremy has been sleeping with his boss's girlfriend, and he is locked out of her flat, and so is Mark, and they're locked in this like, I don't know, in between area, like the lobby of this like set of flats, and they can't get out. And like they're panicking, and Jeremy decides to use the last remaining bars of their phone to call and get pizza delivered, but of course they can't get out, so then they have to like, and bear in mind he needed to have a pee. They had a conversation about where he could pee. He decides to piss through the letterbox. And he's like, "Oh, what are people watching? What are people watching?" He's like, "Oh, it's fine. They'll just see my cock then, won't they?" And it's just like, no.
I think I saw that episode. I'm pretty sure I saw that episode.
It's crazy. And then later on, the pizza comes, and of course, Jeremy goes to Mark. He's like, "Well, do you want some pizza then?" And he's like, "No, I don't want your, piss covered, pizza that's been pushed through this letterbox with like bristles and stuff." Yeah. And they find it, and just on a side note, they found an ingenious way to get it through. So if you ever have this problem, here's what you do. If you ever need to, for whatever reason, push pizza or something smaller through a letterbox with bristles, put it into like a catalog or a small newspaper and push it through that way, and it will be largely untouched. So there you go.
Okay.
But I was kind of like intrigued by that, but also just horrified by the whole situation, because like you talk about like how TV shows and films make you feel. I feel like whenever I watch Peep Show, it's with an intense sense of like anxiety and dread the whole time, even though I know what's going to happen. But it's just awful, but brilliant. Anyway, a few final questions for you. This one I really want to ask about podcasts, but we didn't have a chance to. So when you reached out to me, you mentioned that the show that you wanted to reach out to me about that I did was an uncomfortable podcast to listen to, was your exact words. So what's the most uncomfortable podcast you've ever been a part of?
Oh,
can't say this one.
Oh, no. Well, I mean, it definitely, okay. Actually, believe it or not, it wasn't, I was going to say it had to be one of mine, but no, when I actually reached out to you 2.5 years ago, back in March of 2001, I reached out to several different podcasts, and I did guest spots on probably 3 or 4 different ones. And there was one that was, and no, I'd say no judgment, but I'm about to say some really judgy shit here.
Like when people say like, "Oh, don't worry,"
all due respect.
I don't tell a lie, but don't call me a liar, or not gonna lie, but that's the one. Anyway,
it was a younger, and I would say kid, because I think he was like 16 years old or something.
Mad.
And started his podcast, and I was like his 2nd or 3rd episode, and he had no clue what he was doing. He had absolutely like no idea. Like he just went in and he's like, "Okay, let's start. I'm recording. What do you think we should talk about? What should we talk about today?" And it went for like 45 minutes, and
still a decent 45 minutes.
I am the most egotistical person when it comes to listening back or watching back my own media. I did not go back and listen to that one because it was just dead air, and there was nothing there. There was no there. And it was because there was absolutely no preparation. They had no idea what they wanted their podcast to be about. They just wanted to have a podcast, and they did not care what it was. They just wanted to have a podcast. So they were going to have a podcast. They put a thing out on, I don't know if it was a Reddit thread or something. It was a thing to podcast looking for guests. And that's where I found them. And, it was just, there was absolutely nothing to it. It was just there.
No, well,
I don't know the name of it because I did not even listen to it. So,
I mean, that is often how it starts in the very beginning. I mean, I remember when I first started my show, like I knew I at least I had a plan in place, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm still proud of those earlier episodes, but they are still painful to listen to sometimes. I don't know, but you got to start somewhere.
You got to find your voice, and that takes time. But just the first ones are just kind of getting your feet wet.
Worst guests you've had and why?
Okay. Um,
Can't wait for this. Okay, let me ask you a follow up real
no,
quick.
I'm the only
Is
reason
this a political answer?
no, it's not political. It's just that I've had so few,
Okay.
and all of them I'm sure will check this out, and I do not want
Awkward.
to do that. All right, so I will
All right.
tell you.
Well,
I'll tell you. I won't say who it was, but I'll say why it was.
okay.
My podcast is a movie podcast. There is a certain expectation that I have. And one of the guests that we've had on several times who's actually been very good, he actually said to my other podcast host, that's a real ball buster as far as, because I was asking for, hey, I need this from you, I need this from you, I need this from you, because I need certain things in prep, because I'm the one that produces the show. So I need all these tools, I need all these things in place. I need a headshot, I need this, I need this. And he's like, he's kind of slave driving here. It's like, well, first of all, you're not getting the tone, but there's just an expectation of, you need to do these things. So I had a podcast guest come on. They had not watched the film.
No.
They had seen the film when they were younger, but they had not recently watched the film. They had no notes. They refused to provide me with a headshot that I could do for the, for advertisement, for, putting the word out there. So they gave me nothing to work with. And I basically did a full podcast, mostly just myself, trying to draw them in, but they hadn't seen the film recently, so they couldn't really comment on what I was talking about the film.
Man, it's like pulling teeth, really, isn't it? What do you do? I don't know.
Just push through. And
That's
honestly,
how I felt with that show I told you about earlier, that guest. Like, I don't mind dragging them through the mud. They gave me nothing.
I honestly thought about not publishing it.
Yeah, I shouldn't publish
it was
one
to that point where it's just like, I don't even know if I want to put this out. But oddly enough, I did get feedback from somebody that had never listened to another podcast of mine, that from my wife of all people, and they said they loved it, which I don't know how the hell that happens.
Wow.
So different strokes, I guess.
Final question. Do you have any upcoming projects or final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
No upcoming projects. I want, thank you very much for having me on again.
An honor.
Honestly, if there's ever a time and you are desperate, you need somebody to fill a slot, reach out to me. I have a whole page of notes that did not touch on at all, which is fine. I was concerned. It's like, oh shit, or what are we going to have to talk about? And we filled basically 3 hours more or less with talking about just stuff off the cuff, more or less. But once again, thank you very much. For anybody that's out there that ever has a concern about their health, get it checked out. Don't wait. There are certain things that if they're caught earlier, they can be resolved. If they're not caught, they can't be. Just personal experience on some things that happened. So, if you ever have a question about a health issue, it's better to have it checked out than not have it checked out and have it be something that could have been resolved easier. Other than that, wish nothing but the best to you, both professionally and personally. Thank you once again. Thank you for having me on the show. It has been a great conversation. I think I did a lot less and blah, 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 blah. And I apologize for the power outage and the inability to get on right away. But other than that, I think that's all I got.
Thank you so
but
much,
once again,
man.
Betamax Rewind. I think I got, Betamax Rewind.
Look at that.
Got my own swag. So
thank you so much, man. It's an honor. And you're always welcome back on the show. And just thank you so much, man.
Sounds great. Thank you.
To all the listeners of the Christian Reeve podcast, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. As always, be safe, be well, and I'll see you in the next one.